The rain came down in sheets across the jungle canopy, drumming against the broad leaves with a persistence that matched the artillery fire echoing in the distance. Private James Mitchell pressed his back against the twisted roots of a banyan tree. His rifle clutched across his chest, water streaming down his face and mixing with the sweat that had been pouring from him since dawn. The air was thick, suffocating, a wet heat that made every breath feel like drowning. Somewhere to his left, he could hear Corporal Hernandez breathing hard, the ragged sound of a man who'd been running on nothing but adrenaline and fear for the past 3 days. It was August 1944, and they were somewhere on the island of Peleliu, though the specific coordinates meant nothing anymore. The maps they'd studied aboard the transport ships had been optimistic lies, clean lines and marked positions that bore no resemblance to this green hell where every shadow could hide death and every sound could be your last warning. The island was supposed to have fallen in 3 days. They were now in their 2nd week, and the Japanese defenders showed no sign of surrender, dug into caves and fortified positions that turned every advance into a nightmare of crossfire and hand-to-hand combat. Mitchell was 22 years old, from a small town in Ohio where the biggest excitement had been Friday night football games and summer dances at the community center. He'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, driven by a fury that felt righteous and pure. His father had served in the Great War, had come home with medals and stories that young James had absorbed like gospel: honor, duty, sacrifice. Those words had seemed so clear back then, printed in bold letters on recruitment posters, shouted from movie screens where actors in clean uniforms always knew exactly what to fight for. If you're watching this story unfold, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything as we share these forgotten stories of courage. Now crouched in the mud, with his hands shaking and his ears still ringing from the mortar blast that had killed Thompson 20 minutes ago, those words felt like ash in his mouth. Thompson had been telling a joke, something about a farmer and a chicken, when the shell hit. One moment he was laughing, the next he was gone, just pieces and red mist and that terrible silence that follows violent death. Mitchell had grabbed his rifle and run, following Hernandez into the jungle without thinking, without planning, just moving, because to stop meant to die. "We need to find the others," Hernandez whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. He was older, maybe 30, with a wife and 2 kids back in New Mexico, whose pictures he kept in a waterproof pouch next to his heart. Lieutenant Kohler was heading toward the ridge before we got separated. Mitchell nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. The ridge was 200 yards of open ground, and the Japanese had machine gun nests covering every approach. They'd learned that the hard way on day 3, when Baker Company had tried a frontal assault and been cut down like wheat before a scythe. The survivors had crawled back under cover of darkness, leaving their dead in the coral dust, and nobody had suggested trying that approach again. "What if?" Mitchell started, but Hernandez held up a hand, his head cocked, listening. The jungle had gone quiet. The rain still fell, but the constant background noise, insects, birds, the rustle of small animals, had ceased. Mitchell felt his stomach drop. He'd been in combat long enough to know what that silence meant. The first shot came from directly ahead, the crack of an Arisaka rifle unmistakable. The bullet struck the tree trunk 6 inches from Mitchell's head, spraying bark fragments across his face. He dropped flat, his own rifle coming up instinctively as Hernandez rolled left, returning fire toward the muzzle flash. More shots erupted from multiple positions, and Mitchell realized with cold terror that they'd walked into an ambush. He fired twice, 3 times, working the bolt of his Springfield with hands that had steadied with the familiar action. Across the small clearing, he saw movement. A Japanese soldier in a rain-soaked uniform emerging from behind a fallen log. Mitchell's shot took him in the chest. and the man fell without a sound, but two more appeared to take his place, and now grenades were arcing through the rain, splashing into the mud with deadly purpose. "Fall back!" Hernandez shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Mitchell, move!" They ran, crashing through undergrowth that tore at their uniforms and skin, bullets whipping past their heads and thudding into tree trunks. Mitchell's lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, but terror drove him forward. Behind them he could hear shouting in Japanese, the sound of pursuit. They were being hunted, and there was nowhere to hide in this green maze where the enemy knew every trail and every shadow. The ground dropped away suddenly, and Mitchell found himself sliding down a steep embankment, unable to stop his momentum. He hit the bottom hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs, and rolled into a shallow stream. The water was cool, almost cold after the oppressive heat, and for a moment he lay there gasping, his mind blank with shock and exhaustion. Hernandez tumbled down beside him a second later, cursing in Spanish. "Up!" he gasped, hauling himself to his feet and reaching down to pull Mitchell up. "We can't stop. They're right behind us." But they did stop, because ahead of them, blocking the narrow ravine, stood a Japanese soldier with a rifle trained directly on Hernandez's chest. The man was young, Mitchell saw in that frozen instant, probably no older than he was, with terror in his eyes that mirrored his own. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The rain fell, the jungle dripped. Three young men stood facing each other in the mud, and the weight of the moment pressed down like a physical thing. Mitchell's rifle was still in his hands, but it was pointed at the ground. He could raise it, could try to shoot first, but he knew he wouldn't be fast enough. The Japanese soldier's finger was already on the trigger, white-knuckled with tension. If anyone moved, they would all die here, in this nameless ravine, their bodies left to rot in the jungle while their families back home waited for letters that would never come. "Don't," Hernandez said quietly, and it took Mitchell a moment to realize he was speaking to him, not the enemy. "Easy, kid. Nice and easy." The Japanese soldier said something in his own language, sharp and frightened. His rifle wavered slightly, the barrel moving between them, as if he couldn't decide who was the greater threat. Mitchell found himself studying the man's face, really looking at him for the first time in combat as something other than a target. He saw exhaustion written in the dark circles under his eyes, saw the gaunt hollows of his cheeks that spoke of weeks with insufficient rations. This soldier was as trapped as they were, as terrified, as desperate to survive and go home to whatever life waited beyond this hell. The standoff might have lasted seconds or hours. Time had lost meaning in the adrenaline-soaked chaos. Then, from somewhere up the ravine, a voice called out in Japanese. The soldier's eyes flickered toward the sound, just for an instant, and Hernandez moved. Not to shoot, but to dive sideways, yanking Mitchell with him behind a boulder as the spell broke and the enemy soldier fired, the bullets sparking off stone where they'd been standing. They scrambled up the opposite bank, hauling themselves over roots and rocks, while more shots cracked through the rain. Mitchell's hands found purchase on slick vegetation, his boots dug into soft earth, and then they were over the edge and running again, plunging deeper into the jungle with the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. The terrain changed as they ran, becoming rougher, more vertical. They were climbing now, following what might have been an animal trail, or might have been nothing at all. Mitchell's lungs screamed for air, his legs cramped and threatened to give out, but Hernandez kept pushing forward with dogged determination, and Mitchell couldn't bring himself to be the one who stopped first. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but whether they'd lost their hunters or the Japanese had simply fallen back to regroup was impossible to know. They broke through the tree line onto a rocky outcrop and stopped, both men bent double and gasping for breath. Below them, spread out like a nightmare panorama, was the battlefield. They'd climbed higher than Mitchell had realized, and from this vantage point he could see the full scope of the carnage. The beach where they'd landed, still littered with destroyed landing craft and the detritus of invasion. The airfield, fought over yard by bloody yard, now pockmarked with shell craters. And everywhere the jungle, that endless green expanse that swallowed men whole and gave nothing back. "Jesus," Hernandez breathed, and Mitchell heard something in his voice he'd never heard before. Not fear, not anger, but despair. Raw and absolute. "What the hell are we doing here, Mitchell? What's the point of any of this?" Mitchell didn't have an answer. The patriotic speeches, the clear sense of purpose that had carried him through boot camp and across the Pacific, all of it felt distant now, like something from another life. Here, in this moment, with Thompson's blood still splattered across his uniform and the taste of fear metallic in his mouth, the only truth was survival. Not for country or honor or any of those grand abstractions, but for something more basic and human, the desperate need to see another sunrise, to hold on to life for one more day. "We survive," Mitchell said finally, his voice hoarse. "That's the point. We survive, and we help our brothers survive. And maybe someday we get to go home." Hernandez was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the battlefield. Then he nodded slowly. "Home," he repeated, and the words sounded like a prayer. "Yeah, home." The rain began to ease, the heavy downpour giving way to a steady drizzle. Through the clouds, Mitchell caught a glimpse of late afternoon sun, golden and warm. It felt like a sign, though he wasn't sure of what. They needed to find their unit, needed to get back to friendly lines before darkness fell and the jungle became even more lethal than it already was. But for just a moment, standing on that rocky outcrop with his unlikely companion, Mitchell allowed himself to feel something other than fear. Hope, maybe, or just the stubborn human refusal to surrender to despair. "Come on," Hernandez said, checking his rifle and adjusting his pack. "Ridge is that way. If Kohler made it, that's where he'll be." Indeed, they set off again, moving more carefully now, using cover and checking their surroundings before each advance. The jungle was a maze, but Hernandez seemed to have an instinct for direction that Mitchell envied. They moved in silence, communicating with hand signals, every sense alert for danger. They'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard the voices, American voices, low and cautious. Mitchell felt relief flood through him so powerfully it was almost painful. They weren't alone. Somewhere ahead were friendlies, fellow soldiers who'd made it through the same gauntlet. But as they crept closer to the voices, moving from cover to cover, Mitchell's relief began to curdle into something else. There was something wrong in the tone of those voices, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced at Hernandez and saw the same wariness reflected in the older man's eyes. They reached the edge of a small clearing and stopped, taking in the scene before them. A group of 5 American soldiers stood in a rough circle, their uniforms torn and filthy, their faces haggard with exhaustion and something darker. In the center of the circle, bound hand and foot, was a Japanese prisoner, the soldier from the ravine, Mitchell realized with a shock. They'd captured him, or he'd surrendered, and now he knelt in the mud while his captors stood over him, arguing in harsh whispers. "Can't trust him," one was saying, a sergeant whose name Mitchell didn't know. "He'll give us away first chance he gets." "Lieutenant said to bring back prisoners for interrogation," another countered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Lieutenant's dead," the sergeant spat. "I saw him go down. Ain't nobody left to give us orders but ourselves, and I say this Jap bastard is more trouble than he's worth." The prisoner kept his head down, but Mitchell could see him trembling. Whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, it was impossible to tell. He looked even younger up close, barely more than a boy, and something in Mitchell rebelled at what he saw building in the eyes of the men surrounding him. These were his fellow Americans, soldiers who'd fought beside him and bled for the same cause. But in that moment, watching them circle the helpless prisoner like wolves around wounded prey, Mitchell saw something that terrified him more than enemy fire. He saw what this war was doing to them all, how it was stripping away the civilization and decency they'd carried from home, leaving only the raw animal need to survive and to hurt those who'd hurt them. "We should," Mitchell started to whisper to Hernandez, but the corporal grabbed his arm, pulling him down into cover. "Don't!" Hernandez hissed. "Whatever happens, we didn't see it. You understand? We weren't here." But Mitchell couldn't look away. The sergeant had drawn his pistol, a Colt .45 that looked enormous in the dim light. He was pointing it at the prisoner's head, and the other soldiers had gone quiet, watching, waiting. "For Thompson," the sergeant said, and his voice broke. "For Baker and Rodriguez and all the others. For every American boy these bastards killed." The prisoner looked up, and his eyes met Mitchell's across the clearing. In that instant, Mitchell saw his own reflection, saw two young men caught in a machine bigger than both of them, grinding them down into something unrecognizable. The prisoner didn't plead or cry out. He just looked at Mitchell with that terrible understanding, and then he closed his eyes. The shot never came. Instead, a new voice cut through the clearing, sharp with authority. "Stand down, Sergeant, that's an order." A figure emerged from the jungle. Lieutenant William Kohler, his uniform torn but his bearing unmistakable. He was limping badly, one arm hanging useless at his side, but his eyes were clear and hard as he surveyed the scene. "Lower that weapon, now!" The sergeant hesitated, and for a moment Mitchell thought he might refuse. The jungle had its own rules, and they were far from any authority that mattered, but training and discipline ran deep, even here. The sergeant lowered his pistol, though his jaw clenched with frustration. "He's a prisoner of war," Kohler said, his voice carrying despite its rasp. "We treat him according to the Geneva Convention. That's what separates us from them, gentlemen. That's what makes us Americans." Mitchell felt something unknot in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Beside him, Hernandez let out a long breath. They rose from cover and moved into the clearing, and Kohler's gaze swept over them with relief. "Mitchell, Hernandez, thank God. I thought I'd lost the whole platoon." He turned back to the sergeant. "Get that prisoner on his feet. We're moving out, heading for the rally point at grid 7-4. There's a medical station there, and command needs intel on enemy positions." The sergeant complied, though his movements were rough as he hauled the Japanese soldier upright. The prisoner stumbled, his legs numb from kneeling, and Mitchell found himself stepping forward instinctively to steady him. Their eyes met again, and something passed between them. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but perhaps a recognition of their shared humanity in circumstances that denied it. "Sir," Mitchell said carefully, "what's the situation? Do we still hold the airfield?" Kohler's expression darkened. "Barely. The Japanese have counterattacked twice since dawn, and they're dug in deeper than we thought possible. Command is calling in airstrikes, but until we can clear those ridge positions, we're stuck in a stalemate." He paused, his gaze distant. "We've lost a lot of good men, Mitchell. More than the brass back home will ever admit." They formed up and began moving through the jungle, Kohler setting a pace that was steady despite his injuries. The lieutenant had always been a good officer, firm but fair, the kind who led from the front rather than barking orders from behind. Mitchell had seen him pull wounded men from no man's land under fire, had watched him share his own rations with soldiers who'd lost their packs. Now, watching him navigate through the hostile terrain with one arm useless and his leg dragging, Mitchell felt a surge of respect that bordered on reverence. This was what heroism looked like, he realized. Not the glamorous images from movies, not the stirring speeches and dramatic sacrifices. Just a man doing his duty despite pain and fear, holding on to his principles when it would be easier to let them go. If they made it through this hell, nobody back home would ever know Lieutenant Kohler's name. There would be no medals or parades for the small choice he'd made in that clearing, the decision to stay human when the jungle offered easier paths. But Mitchell would remember, and maybe that was enough. The rally point turned out to be a bombed-out bunker that had changed hands 3 times in the past week. American engineers had reinforced it with sandbags and corrugated metal, creating a makeshift aid station and command post. The smell hit Mitchell before they even entered, blood and antiseptic and the sweet rot of gangrene, mixing with cigarette smoke and sweat to create an odor that branded itself into memory. Inside, chaos reigned in the organized way of military medicine. Medics moved between rows of wounded men, their hands stained red, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. The field surgeon worked at a makeshift operating table, his voice calm as he called for instruments and ordered morphine. Somewhere in the back, a soldier was screaming, long, ragged cries that spoke of pain beyond endurance. Kohler directed them to turn over the prisoner to the intelligence officer, a captain who looked barely old enough to shave. Then he ordered Mitchell and Hernandez to get their wounds treated, minor cuts and scrapes they'd barely noticed in the adrenaline of survival. A medic with kind eyes cleaned Mitchell's lacerations with practiced efficiency, his touch gentle despite the sting of antiseptic. "You're lucky," the medic said, his southern accent soft. "These could have gotten infected in this climate. I've seen men lose limbs to wounds that started smaller than this." Mitchell nodded, watching the medic work. The man's hands were steady, his movements precise, and Mitchell found himself wondering about his story. Who was he before the war? A doctor in training, a farmer who'd learned medicine in the field. Did he have family waiting at home, writing letters he might never get to answer? "What's your name?" Mitchell asked suddenly. The medic looked up, surprised. "Davis. Corporal Marcus Davis from Alabama." "Thank you, Corporal Davis, for what you're doing here. It matters." Something flickered in Davis's eyes, gratitude maybe, or recognition that someone had seen him as more than just a pair of hands treating wounds. "We all do what we can," he said quietly. "You boys on the front lines, us back here patching you up. It's all part of the same fight." When the medic finished, Mitchell found Hernandez sitting outside the bunker, smoking a cigarette and staring at nothing. The corporal looked older than he had that morning, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. Mitchell sat down beside him without speaking, and for a long time they just existed in that shared silence that veterans understand. "You did good today," Hernandez said finally. "In the clearing, when you looked at that prisoner like he was human. Takes guts to remember that in a place like this." "Kohler did the hard part," Mitchell replied. "Yeah, but you saw it first. You felt it. A lot of men wouldn't." Hernandez took a long drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing bright in the fading light. "My oldest boy. He's 7 now. When I left, he asked me if I was going to kill bad men. I told him I was going to protect good people. Never really thought about the difference until today. What changed? I saw that Japanese kid's face. Saw the same fear I feel every damn day. Made me wonder if his father told him he was protecting good people too. If both our kids are waiting at home for fathers who've become something neither of them would recognize." He crushed out the cigarette. "War makes killers of us all, Mitchell. The trick is remembering we were something else first." Night fell quickly in the Pacific, the brief tropical twilight giving way to darkness so complete it felt solid. The jungle came alive with nocturnal sounds, insects and animals, and the constant drip of moisture from leaves. Somewhere out there, Japanese soldiers were doing exactly what Mitchell was doing, checking weapons, eating cold rations, trying not to think about what tomorrow might bring. The command post had set up a perimeter with machine gun positions and trip flares, but everyone knew it was mostly psychological comfort. The Japanese were masters of infiltration, and if they wanted to probe the American lines during darkness, barbed wire and sandbags wouldn't stop them. The night would be long and sleepless, every sound a potential threat, every shadow a possible enemy. Mitchell was assigned to a 4-hour watch, partnered with a private named Chen, whose family had immigrated from China before he was born. Chen spoke quietly of his home in San Francisco, of streets that climbed steep hills and fog that rolled in from the bay. He'd enlisted to prove his loyalty, he said, to show that he was American through and through, even though his face made some people question it. "My grandmother," Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper, "she survived the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, lost everything, her home, her husband, her 2 daughters. She has nightmares still, wakes up screaming in Chinese about soldiers and fire. When I told her I'd enlisted to fight Japan, she cried, said I was a good boy, that I would honor the family." "You miss her?" Mitchell asked. "Every day. But this—" Chen gestured at the darkness around them, the hostile jungle and distant sounds of artillery. "This is why I'm here. So she can sleep without nightmares. So people like her never have to run again." It was the most coherent explanation of purpose Mitchell had heard since landing on this god-forsaken island. Not abstractions about freedom or democracy, but something concrete and personal. A grandson fighting monsters so his grandmother could find peace. It was small and human, and somehow more true than all the propaganda posters combined. "Think we'll make it?" Mitchell asked. "Think we'll see home again?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. "I think some of us will," he said finally. "And those who do have a responsibility to the ones who don't, to remember, to tell their stories, to make sure their deaths meant something more than dirt and blood." Before Mitchell could respond, the night erupted with sound. Explosions tore through the darkness, incoming mortar rounds that screamed down from the sky and detonated with earth-shaking force. The Japanese attack had begun, and there would be no more time for philosophy or reflection. Only survival. Only the next moment and the moment after that, strung together in a desperate attempt to see another dawn. Mitchell threw himself flat as shrapnel whined overhead. Beside him, Chen was already returning fire, his rifle bucking against his shoulder as he aimed at muzzle flashes in the darkness. All around them, the American position dissolved into chaos, men shouting, weapons firing, the wet slap of bullets hitting sandbags and flesh. A Japanese soldier materialized out of the darkness, his bayonet gleaming in the flash of explosions. Mitchell rolled, bringing his rifle up, but Chen was faster. The crack of his shot merged with the enemy soldier's scream as the man fell backward into the night. More came behind him, shadows with rifles and grenades, and suddenly the battle was intimate and terrible, fought at ranges where you could see your enemy's face as you killed him. Mitchell fired until his rifle's magazine was empty, then worked the bolt to load another round with hands that had gone numb with adrenaline. A grenade landed 3 feet away, and he had maybe 2 seconds to recognize it before Chen dove on top of it, covering the explosive with his own body. The detonation was muffled, horrible, and Chen's scream cut off instantly as he was torn apart. "No!" Mitchell heard himself shouting, though the word was lost in the cacophony of battle. He crawled forward, his hands finding Chen's body, searching desperately for signs of life, even though he knew, God, he knew, that nobody could survive that. Chen's blood was hot on his hands, soaking into the ground, and Mitchell felt something inside him break. This was supposed to mean something. Chen's sacrifice, his grandmother's nightmares, all the young men dying in the mud. It was supposed to add up to something more than waste. But crouched there in the darkness with his friend's body cooling beneath his hands, Mitchell couldn't see the meaning. He could only feel the loss, raw and absolute. Mitchell! Hernandez's voice cut through his shock. Leave him! We need you on the line! Mitchell forced himself to move, to return to his position and keep fighting. He fired mechanically, not aiming so much as pointing his rifle toward movement and pulling the trigger. The battle seemed to last hours, though later he'd learn it was less than 20 minutes from first shot to the Japanese withdrawal. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence felt wrong, a vacuum where sound should be. 47 Americans had been killed or wounded in the attack. 13 more were missing, probably dragged away by the enemy or lost in the confusion. Chen was dead. So was Lieutenant Kohler, killed by a mortar fragment while directing defensive fire. The medical station had taken a direct hit, and the screaming that followed would haunt Mitchell's dreams for decades. But they'd held. Despite the losses, despite the terror and chaos, the American position had held. In the cold mathematics of warfare, that counted as a victory. As dawn broke over the jungle, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that felt obscene in their beauty, Mitchell sat among the survivors and tried to understand what he'd become. He'd killed men whose faces he'd never seen. He'd watched friends die. He'd been saved by a sacrifice he could never repay. And through it all, some part of him had kept functioning, kept fighting, driven by instincts more basic than thought. Was this heroism? This ugly, brutal struggle to survive while others died? Or was heroism what Chen had done, throwing himself on a grenade to save strangers? What about Kohler, insisting on honor even when the jungle offered easier choices? Or Hernandez pulling Mitchell through hell with nothing but stubborn determination and foul-mouthed encouragement? Mitchell didn't have answers. He had only questions, and the terrible certainty that the war was far from over. They'd fought for this bunker, this god-forsaken piece of coral and mud, and tomorrow they'd fight for another, and another after that. Each battle a story that would never be told, each death a name that would be forgotten except by those who loved them. But they would keep fighting, because that's what soldiers did, because somewhere back home people were counting on them. Because the alternative, surrender, defeat, the triumph of tyranny, was unthinkable. Not because they were heroes in the movie sense, but because they were Americans, and they'd been raised to believe that freedom mattered more than comfort, that duty outweighed fear, that some things were worth dying for, even if you couldn't articulate exactly what they were. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, Mitchell cleaned his rifle and prepared for whatever came next. Somewhere in the jungle, Japanese soldiers were doing the same. The war would continue, grinding them all down. But for this moment, this brief respite between battles, Mitchell allowed himself to remember Chen's smile, Kohler's integrity, Thompson's terrible joke. He allowed himself to grieve and to hope, and to wonder if any of them would live long enough to make these sacrifices matter. The answer, he suspected, wouldn't come on this island, or even in this war. It would come in the years after, in the world they built from these ruins, in whether they could hold on to their humanity long enough to create something better than what they'd destroyed. That was the real battle, Mitchell realized. Not the one fought with rifles and grenades, but the one fought in each soldier's heart, the struggle to remain human in circumstances designed to make them monsters. And that battle had no end date, no surrender ceremony, no clear victor. It would last as long as they did, a private war waged in silence and remembered by none except those who fought it. But it was no less important for being invisible. Perhaps it was more important because that was the war that would determine what kind of men they became, what kind of nation they returned to, what legacy they left for the grandmothers and grandsons who would come after. Mitchell shouldered his rifle and rejoined his unit. The next battle was waiting, and there was nothing to do but face it, without glory, without recognition, without any certainty except the brotherhood of the men beside him and the distant hope of home. It would have to be enough. It was all they had. The days blurred together after that first night. Mitchell lost count somewhere around day 12, though others in what remained of his squad kept a tally by carving notches into their rifle stocks. The bunker became a fixed point in the chaos, a place they returned to after patrols and skirmishes, a spot on the map that represented something close to safety, though nobody was foolish enough to believe anywhere on Peleliu was truly safe. The island had become a meat grinder, and they were the meat. Every morning brought new orders to advance, to take another ridge or secure another position. Every evening brought them back, fewer in number, covered in mud and blood that wasn't always their own. The Japanese defenders had turned the coral formations into a fortress that seemed designed by a sadistic god, with interlocking fields of fire and hidden positions that could pour death down on any approach. Mitchell had been promoted to corporal after Hernandez took shrapnel in the leg during a dawn patrol. The older man was evacuated to a hospital ship, and before they loaded him onto the stretcher, he'd grabbed Mitchell's arm with surprising strength. "You keep your head down," Hernandez had said, his face grey with pain. "And you keep those boys alive. That's all that matters now." So Mitchell found himself responsible for 8 men, boys really, the youngest barely 19, Private Danny Torres from Texas, who'd lied about his age to enlist. Sergeant Joe Baker, a career soldier who'd been in the army since before the war and treated combat with grim professionalism. PFC Robert Lee, who read poetry in the rare quiet moments and wrote letters to a girl back home that grew more desperate with each draft. Lance Corporal Vincent Russo, a Brooklyn kid who could make anyone laugh even when there was nothing funny about their situation. And 4 others, whose names and faces Mitchell memorized with the intensity of prayer, because he knew that if any of them died under his command, their ghosts would follow him for the rest of his life. This was what leadership meant in combat, not glory or authority, but the crushing weight of responsibility for lives that were fragile as glass and precious as gold. They were assigned to a patrol, reconnaissance in force, the lieutenant called it, which was military speak for walk into enemy territory and see who shoots at you. The objective was a ridge system called the Umurbragol, though the Marines had given it a different name, Bloody Nose Ridge. Mitchell understood why the moment he saw it through his field glasses. The coral formation rose from the jungle like jagged teeth, all sharp edges and blind corners. Caves pockmarked its surface, each one potentially hiding enemy soldiers and weapons. The Japanese had spent months fortifying these positions, turning natural defenses into something that approached impregnable. 3 companies had already tried to take the ridge, and 3 companies had been shredded by machine gun fire and mortar barrages that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "They want us to probe the eastern approach," Baker explained, studying the map with a professional's eye. "See if we can find a weak point, maybe locate some of their gun positions for the artillery to target." "That's suicide," Torres said flatly. The Texan had lost his earlier enthusiasm for combat somewhere around day 5, when he'd seen his best friend cut in half by machine gun fire. "They'll see us coming from a mile away." "Then we don't let them see us," Mitchell said, surprised by the confidence in his own voice. "We go in slow, use every bit of cover. No heroics, no taking chances. We observe, we report, we come back alive. Understood?" They nodded, and Mitchell saw something in their eyes that made his chest tight. Trust. These men were trusting him to keep them alive, to make the right calls, to bring them through hell and back to something approaching safety. It was more responsibility than he'd ever imagined carrying, and there was no training manual for the weight of it. They set out at dawn, moving in a loose column through the jungle. Mitchell had learned something about this terrain in the past 2 weeks. It could hide you, as well as it could hide the enemy, if you knew how to read it. They stuck to low ground, using gullies and stream beds for concealment. They moved during bird calls and insect noise, freezing when the jungle went silent. Baker took point, his experience showing in every careful step. Mitchell brought up the rear, constantly checking their back trail for signs of pursuit. In between, the other men moved like ghosts, their earlier clumsiness refined by 2 weeks of combat into something approaching competence. They'd been moving for perhaps 2 hours when Baker raised a fist, the signal to stop. Mitchell crept forward, staying low, until he was beside the sergeant. Baker pointed ahead, and Mitchell felt his breath catch. The ridge system sprawled before them, even more imposing up close than it had seemed through field glasses. But that wasn't what had stopped Baker. Carved into the coral face, partially hidden by vegetation, were fortified positions. Bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, artillery placements dug deep enough to survive anything short of a direct hit. And manning them were dozens of Japanese soldiers, moving with the casual confidence of men who knew they held every advantage. Jesus, Mitchell breathed. There must be a full company up there. At least, Baker agreed, and this is just one section. The whole ridge is probably honeycombed with positions like this. He pulled out a notepad, sketching quickly. We need to get this back to command. This isn't a patrol action. We're going to need armor, heavy artillery, maybe airstrikes to even make a dent. They were backing away, moving slowly to avoid detection, when Torres stepped on something that clicked. In the instant before the explosion, Mitchell had time to think with perfect clarity, landmine. Then the world dissolved into fire and sound and pain. Mitchell found himself on his back, his ears ringing so badly he couldn't hear anything else. His vision was blurred, red with blood from a cut on his forehead. He tried to move and discovered his left leg wouldn't respond properly. Looking down, he saw shrapnel had torn through his calf, and there was more blood than seemed possible coming from the wound. Around him, the rest of the patrol was scattered like toys. Torres was screaming, or at least his mouth was open and his face was twisted in agony. Mitchell couldn't hear it over the ringing in his ears. Russo was crawling toward him, his uniform torn, blood streaming from multiple wounds. And Baker wasn't moving. The sergeant lay face down in the mud, and even through his dazed state, Mitchell knew with terrible certainty that he was dead. The man who'd survived years of combat, who'd made it through North Africa and Sicily, had finally found the bullet with his name on it on this god-forsaken coral island. Mitchell forced himself to focus through the pain and shock. They were exposed. The explosion had given away their position, and any second Japanese soldiers would come pouring down from those fortifications to finish them off. He had to get his men moving, hands grabbed him, hauling him upright. Lee had appeared beside him, his face set in determination. "Can you walk?" Lee shouted, his voice barely audible through the ringing. Mitchell tested his leg and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through him like lightning. But he could put weight on it barely. "Yeah," he gasped. "Torres? Bad. Lost his foot. Russo's helping him." Lee's eyes were wide with fear, but his hands were steady as he supported Mitchell's weight. "We need to move, Corporal. Now." The next hour was a nightmare of pain and fear. They fled through the jungle, half carrying Torres, while behind them they could hear shouts in Japanese and the sounds of pursuit. Mitchell's legs screamed with every step, and several times he nearly blacked out from the pain, but Lee wouldn't let him fall. The private kept them moving, kept them together, even when it seemed like they'd never make it. They ran into an American patrol, purely by chance, a squad from Charlie Company that was returning from their own reconnaissance. The Marines took one look at the bleeding, exhausted group and immediately formed a defensive perimeter, their weapons trained on the jungle behind them. A corpsman went to work on Torres with quick, practiced efficiency, while another looked at Mitchell's leg and made a sound that suggested it was bad. "Hospital ship for you," the corpsman said, wrapping a tourniquet above the wound. This is going to get infected if we don't get you proper treatment. You're lucky, another inch and it would have hit the artery. But Mitchell barely heard him. He was staring back the way they'd come, thinking about Baker lying dead in the jungle, about the fortifications they'd discovered, about all the other men who would die trying to take that ridge. They'd accomplished their mission, brought back intelligence on enemy positions, but the cost felt too high, and the battle was far from over. They were loaded onto stretchers and carried back to the aid station, where the organized chaos of military medicine swallowed them. Mitchell drifted in and out of consciousness as doctors worked on his leg, their voices calm and professional, even as they dealt with wounds that would give them nightmares for years. He woke once to find Lee sitting beside him, the private's hands bandaged but his eyes alert. "Torres?" Mitchell managed to ask. "Alive." "They got him stabilized, shipped him out to the hospital ship. He'll lose the foot, but he'll live." Lee paused. "Baker didn't make it. Russo died an hour ago. Internal bleeding they couldn't stop." 2 more names for the list. 2 more ghosts. Mitchell closed his eyes against tears that had nothing to do with physical pain. He'd been responsible for those men, and he'd failed them. That the mine was random, that there was no way to have seen it, didn't matter. They were dead and he was alive, and that fact would haunt him. "You did good, Corporal," Lee said quietly. "You got most of us out. In a place like this, that's all anyone can do." But it didn't feel like enough. It would never feel like enough. Mitchell spent 3 days in the aid station before infection set in, and they evacuated him to the hospital ship USS Solace, anchored offshore. The ship was a floating city of pain, its wards filled with wounded men from across the Pacific theater. Soldiers and Marines lay in rows of bunks, their bodies broken in ways that defied easy description. Some would recover, many wouldn't. All of them had that same look in their eyes, the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much, surviving too much, losing too much. The ship's doctors saved Mitchell's leg through a combination of sulfur drugs, surgery, and what felt like sheer stubbornness. He would walk again, they told him, though he'd limp for the rest of his life. It was more than many men got, and he tried to be grateful for it. While he recovered, new wounded arrived daily. Mitchell heard their stories, tales of battles on Peleliu that made his own experience seem almost merciful by comparison. The fighting had intensified as the Marines pushed deeper into the island's interior, and the casualties reflected it. Whole platoons were being wiped out in single engagements. Companies that had landed at full strength were down to a handful of effective soldiers, and yet they kept fighting. Day after day, week after week, American forces threw themselves against Japanese positions with a determination that bordered on insanity. The original prediction of a 3-day battle had become a sick joke. They were approaching 3 weeks with no end in sight, and the butcher's bill kept growing. Mitchell met a Marine lieutenant in the recovery ward, a man named Douglas who'd lost his right arm to a mortar blast. Douglas had been on Peleliu since the first day, had watched the battle evolve from an amphibious assault to a grinding war of attrition. He spoke about it with the detached precision of someone trying to make sense of senseless carnage. "The Japanese changed their tactics," Douglas explained, his voice hoarse from screaming through his own surgery. "They learned from the other islands. No more banzai charges, no more wasting men on suicide attacks. Now they dig in, make us come to them, turn every position into a fortress. They know they can't win, but they can make us pay in blood for every yard." "Why?" Mitchell asked. "What's the point if they know they'll lose? Honor, duty, emperor. Pick your reason." Douglas shook his head. "Or maybe they're just doing what we're doing, fighting because that's what soldiers do, because they can't imagine any alternative. We're not so different, really. Just young men with rifles, dying for flags we didn't make, and causes we don't fully understand. It was the most honest thing Mitchell had heard since the war began. Not propaganda about good versus evil, not speeches about freedom and democracy, just the bare truth of what combat actually was. Young men killing each other because old men had decided it was necessary. "You think it's worth it?" Mitchell asked. "All this death, all this suffering, does it add up to something meaningful?" Douglas was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "Ask me again in 50 years if we're both still alive. Maybe then we'll have enough distance to see if any of this mattered." Mitchell was in the hospital ship for 2 weeks before they declared him fit enough to return to limited duty. His leg was healing, though the doctors warned him it would never be the same. He'd need physical therapy, and he'd always have some degree of impairment, but he could walk, could stand, and the Marines needed every able-bodied man they could get. Before he left the Solace, Mitchell wrote letters. One to Torres, care of whatever hospital stateside he'd been sent to, wishing him well and apologizing for the mine he couldn't have predicted. One to Baker's widow, trying to find words that could somehow communicate what her husband had meant, how he'd died doing his duty, how he'd be remembered. One to Chen's grandmother in San Francisco, explaining that her grandson had died a hero, that his sacrifice had saved lives, that his memory would be honored. He didn't know if any of the letters would ever arrive, if the words he'd struggled over would bring any comfort. But he needed to write them, needed to try to give meaning to losses that felt meaningless. When he finally returned to Peleliu, the island looked different. The battle had moved inland, away from the beaches where they'd first landed. The Japanese had been pushed back but not defeated, and now the fighting centered on that nightmare ridge system Mitchell's patrol had discovered. American forces were using flamethrowers, explosives, and sheer courage to clear cave after cave, bunker after bunker. It was some of the most brutal combat of the Pacific War. Close quarters fighting in darkness and enclosed spaces where the enemy could be anywhere and death came from unexpected angles. The casualty rates were staggering. Units were ground down to nothing and reformed from survivors and replacements, only to be ground down again. Mitchell was assigned to a new squad, replacing casualties from the ongoing battle. None of his original platoon remained. They were all dead, wounded, or transferred. He was surrounded by new faces, men who didn't know him and whom he didn't know, and he had to build trust all over again while fighting the same grinding battle. His new squad leader was a sergeant named Williams, a black man from Georgia who'd been fighting segregation and the enemy in equal measure. The military was still segregated in 1944, but combat had a way of breaking down some barriers. When men were dying together, skin color seemed less important than competence and courage. "I heard about you," Williams said when Mitchell reported in. "Heard you led your squad out of an ambush. Got most of them home. That's good work, Mitchell. We need soldiers who can think under fire." Mitchell wanted to tell him about Baker and Russo, about the 2 men who hadn't made it home, but Williams stopped him with a look that said he already knew. That he'd been through the same experience himself, probably multiple times. That grief was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. "We're going up the ridge tomorrow," Williams continued. "3rd assault this week. The Japs are dug in deep, but we're making progress. Slow, bloody progress, but progress. You stick with me, keep your head down, and maybe we'll both see the day after tomorrow." It was the most honest pep talk Mitchell had ever heard, and somehow that made it more reassuring than any grand speech about duty or patriotism. They were all just trying to survive, to get through one more day, to maybe see home again someday. That night, Mitchell couldn't sleep. His leg throbbed despite the painkillers, and his mind kept replaying the mine explosion, the sound of Torres screaming, the sight of Baker's body. He'd heard other soldiers talk about combat nightmares, but he'd never fully understood until now. The memories played on an endless loop, and no amount of willpower could make them stop. He found himself outside the tent, staring up at stars that looked impossibly bright and distant. Somewhere under these same stars, his family was living their lives. His mother probably worrying, his father reading the newspaper and trying to understand what was happening in this far corner of the world, his younger sister dreaming about her own future. They felt like characters from a story now, people he'd known in another life. Can't sleep either. A voice beside him made Mitchell turn. It was a soldier he didn't recognize, older, maybe 40, with graying hair and tired eyes. Name's Patterson, supply sergeant, been on this rock since day one. Mitchell, infantry, just got back from the hospital ship. Patterson nodded. Saw a lot of boys go through that cycle, get wounded, get patched up, come back to fight some more. It's like we're stuck in a loop, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. He lit a cigarette, the brief flare illuminating a face carved by exhaustion. You want to know the worst part? It's working. Slowly, painfully, at a cost that makes you sick to calculate, but we're winning. Another few weeks and this island will be ours. And then what? Mitchell asked. We move to the next island and do it all again? Probably. Philippines, then Okinawa, then maybe Japan itself. Patterson took a long drag. But every island is one step closer to home. Every battle is one we don't have to fight again. You got to hold on to that, Mitchell. The progress, not the cost. Otherwise, you'll go crazy trying to make sense of it. They stood in silence for a while, two soldiers sharing a moment of peace in the middle of war. Eventually, Patterson stubbed out his cigarette and headed back to his tent, leaving Mitchell alone with the stars and his thoughts. The assault on the ridge began at dawn, preceded by an artillery barrage that turned the coral formations into a landscape from a nightmare. Shells screamed overhead and detonated with earth-shaking force, sending up plumes of coral dust and smoke. But Mitchell had seen enough combat to know that artillery rarely killed men in caves. It just made them hunker down and wait for the shelling to stop so they could emerge and man their guns. Williams led them forward in a loose formation, using shell craters and coral outcroppings for cover. The approach was slow and methodical, no heroic charges, no foolish risks. Just professional soldiers doing a difficult job with grim competence. Mitchell's leg complained with every step, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. The Japanese opened fire when they were halfway to the first cave system. Machine gun bullets kicked up coral dust and whined off rocks, forcing them to dive for cover. Somewhere to Mitchell's left, a Marine screamed as he was hit, a sound that cut through the battle noise with terrible clarity. The corpsman rushed forward to help him while the rest of the squad returned fire, trying to suppress the enemy position enough to allow an advance. Williams tossed a smoke grenade, and purple smoke billowed across their front, providing concealment. "Move!" he shouted, and they scrambled forward through the smoke, racing against time before it dissipated. Mitchell's damaged leg nearly gave out twice, but he forced himself onward through pure willpower. They reached the cave entrance, a dark opening in the coral that looked like a mouth ready to swallow them. Williams signaled for a flamethrower team, and two Marines moved up with their bulky equipment. The weapon ignited with a whoosh, and liquid fire poured into the cave entrance, turning darkness into hell. Screams echoed from inside, terrible, agonized sounds that would haunt Mitchell's dreams. But when the flames died and they cautiously entered the cave, they found it connected to a network of tunnels and chambers. The Japanese had turned the entire ridge into an underground fortress, with positions that could support each other and fallback routes that allowed defenders to retreat and regroup. Clearing one cave meant nothing. There were dozens more, all interconnected, all filled with enemy soldiers who would fight to the death. The battle devolved into a nightmare of close-quarters combat in darkness. Grenades echoed in confined spaces, muzzle flashes temporarily blinded them, and the air filled with smoke and coral dust that made breathing difficult. Mitchell lost track of time and direction, following Williams through the tunnel system by instinct and desperation. They cleared 3 chambers before the counterattack hit. Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels they hadn't yet explored, attacking from behind and cutting them off from the entrance. In the chaos that followed, Mitchell found himself fighting hand-to-hand with an enemy soldier, their rifles forgotten as they grappled in the darkness. He felt the man's hands on his throat, felt his own grip on the enemy's rifle, and knew that one of them would die in the next few seconds. Mitchell's hand found a rock, and he brought it down on the soldier's head with all his strength. Once, twice, 3 times, until the hands on his throat loosened and the body went limp. He rolled away, gasping for air, his hands shaking with adrenaline and horror. He'd killed before, from a distance with a rifle, but this was different, intimate and terrible in a way that would never leave him. "Mitchell!" Williams's voice cut through the chaos. "Regroup at the entrance. Fall back!" They fought their way back through the tunnels, leaving 2 more dead behind them. When they finally emerged into daylight, Mitchell counted heads and felt his stomach drop. They'd gone in with 12 men. 7 came out. The assault was called off after 6 hours. They'd made minimal progress at terrible cost, and command decided to try a different approach, isolating and bypassing the strongest positions while clearing the weaker ones. It would take longer, but it might cost fewer lives. In war, nothing was certain except death and suffering. As Mitchell sat in the gathering dusk, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision, he thought about Patterson's words. They were winning, slowly, painfully, but winning. Did that make the sacrifice worthwhile? Did Torres's foot and Baker's life and all the other casualties add up to something meaningful? He didn't know, but he understood now that asking the question was a luxury that soldiers in combat couldn't afford. They had to believe it mattered, had to find meaning in the suffering, because the alternative was madness. And so they would keep fighting, keep sacrificing, keep dying in caves and jungles on islands most Americans couldn't find on a map. Because they were Americans, and this was what their country had asked of them. Not glory or heroism in the movie sense, but endurance. The will to keep going when everything in them screamed to stop, to hold on to their humanity when circumstances conspired to strip it away, to believe that somewhere beyond this hell was a future worth fighting for. As darkness fell over Peleliu, Mitchell allowed himself a small hope that they would survive this battle, this island, this war, that someday he would go home and try to build a life from the wreckage of what he'd experienced. That the sacrifices made here would somehow, in ways he couldn't yet see, contribute to a better world. It was a fragile hope, easily shattered. But in the darkness of war, even fragile hope was better than none at all. The weeks that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of violence and exhaustion. Mitchell's squad, what remained of it, and whatever replacements arrived to fill the gaps, became experts in a particular kind of warfare that no training manual adequately prepared them for. They learned to move through the coral ridges like ghosts, to distinguish between safe caves and death traps, to coordinate flamethrowers and demolitions with infantry advances. They learned, most of all, to accept casualties as an inevitable cost of progress measured in yards rather than miles. By early October, the Marines had been fighting on Peleliu for 3 weeks, and what was supposed to be a 4-day operation had devolved into a siege. The Army's 81st Infantry Division had been brought in to relieve the decimated Marine regiments, but even fresh troops found the Umabrogol Mountains, that hellish complex of caves and fortifications the men now simply called the Pocket, almost impossible to crack. Mitchell had been transferred to a combined unit, Marines and Army soldiers working together in what command euphemistically called force integration. In reality, it meant they were running out of men and couldn't afford the luxury of service rivalry. His new squad included soldiers from the 321st Infantry Regiment, men who'd seen their own share of combat, but were still shocked by the conditions on Peleliu. "Jesus Christ," muttered Private First Class Eddie Morrison, a farm boy from Iowa who'd joined the army expecting to fight in Europe. "How long have you Marines been dealing with this?" "Since day one," Mitchell replied, checking his ammunition. They were preparing for another assault on a cave complex that intelligence believed housed a Japanese command post. "You get used to it. Sort of." That was a lie, of course. Nobody got used to this. You just learned to function despite the fear, to keep moving when every instinct screamed at you to find a hole and hide until the war ended. Mitchell had watched enough men break, seen them freeze under fire, or start crying and refuse to move, or simply walk away from their positions like they were leaving a bad party, to know that everyone had a breaking point. He just hadn't found his yet. Staff Sergeant Williams had made it through the past weeks by some combination of skill, luck, and sheer stubbornness. He'd become something of a legend in the battalion, the sergeant who couldn't be killed, who walked through machine gun fire like it was summer rain. Mitchell knew it was just survivor bias, that dozens of equally skilled sergeants had died in those same weeks, but there was something comforting about serving under someone who seemed invincible. "Listen up," Williams said, gathering the squad around a crude map drawn in the coral dust. "This cave system has at least 3 entrances we know about, probably more we don't. Intelligence thinks there's maybe a company of Japanese holed up inside, well supplied and well armed. Our job is to seal the secondary entrances while Easy Company hits the main entrance with tanks and flamethrowers." "Seal them how?" asked Corporal James Riley, a combat engineer who'd been attached to their unit. "Explosives. We're going to blow the entrances, trap them inside. Then we either wait them out or pump the caves full of gas." Williams's face was expressionless, but Mitchell saw the tension in his jaw. Even after weeks of this brutal warfare, something still bothered the sergeant. "I don't like it any more than you do, but we've tried everything else. They won't surrender, won't come out. This is what's left." They moved out at dawn, taking advantage of the brief period when the tropical heat hadn't yet become unbearable. Mitchell's leg had healed enough that he could move without obvious limping, though it ached constantly, and he knew it would never be the same. Small price, he told himself. Torres lost his foot. Chen lost everything. The approach to the cave system took them through terrain that looked like the surface of another planet. Blasted coral formations, dead vegetation, shell craters filled with stagnant water that bred mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue fever. The smell was something Mitchell had stopped noticing weeks ago, though new arrivals still gagged on the combination of decay, explosives, residue, and human waste. They'd learned to move in a spread formation, using every bit of cover, never bunching up where a single mortar round could wipe out multiple men. Williams led them through a route that intelligence had marked as relatively safe, which meant only that nobody had been killed there recently. In this nightmare landscape, that was the best you could hope for. The cave entrance they were assigned to seal was smaller than Mitchell expected, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Riley examined it with professional interest, running his hands along the coral edges and peering into the darkness beyond. "It goes back at least 30 feet before it turns," he said quietly. "Could be a munition storage, could be a barracks, could be a command post. No way to know without going in, and I'm not volunteering for that." "How much explosive do you need?" Williams asked. "To collapse it completely? Maybe 50 pounds of TNT placed right at the load-bearing points, but that assumes we can get close enough without getting shot at." Riley pointed at the cave mouth. "They've got a perfect kill zone. Anyone approaching is completely exposed." Williams studied the terrain with the calculating eye of someone who'd survived too many battles to take stupid chances. "We'll use smoke for cover. Morrison, You and Chen lay down, suppressing fire on that ridgeline. I don't want any observers calling down mortars on us. Mitchell, you're with me and Riley. We go in fast. Plant the charges. Get out faster." It sounded simple when he said it like that. Military operations always did, reduced to clean steps and clear objectives. Reality was messier. Reality involved crawling through coral that tore at your uniform and skin, breathing smoke that made your lungs burn, knowing that any second a Japanese soldier could appear at that cave entrance with a machine gun and end you before you even registered the threat. But they'd done this before, and they'd do it again, because this was the job and there was nobody else to do it. Mitchell checked his rifle one more time, made sure his grenades were secure, and prepared himself mentally for the next few minutes that would determine whether he lived or died. The smoke grenades went off with soft pops, and white clouds billowed across the approach to the cave. Morrison and Chen opened fire on the ridge, their rifles cracking in rhythmic precision. Williams moved first, running low and fast, and Mitchell followed with Riley struggling to keep up while carrying his demolition pack. They made it to the cave entrance without drawing fire, which Mitchell knew meant either they'd been lucky or the Japanese inside were waiting for them to enter before springing an ambush. Riley went to work immediately, pulling blocks of TNT from his pack and wedging them into cracks in the coral. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, connecting wires and setting primers with the calm of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Mitchell and Williams covered the entrance, their rifles trained on the darkness beyond. Mitchell could hear sounds from deep in the cave, voices speaking Japanese, the scrape of equipment being moved. There were men in there, living men who would die when these explosives went off. Men who probably had families waiting for them, who'd been drafted or volunteered for reasons that seemed noble at the time, who were just as trapped by this war as Mitchell was. He pushed the thought away. Sympathy was a luxury that got you killed. These were enemy soldiers who would kill him without hesitation given the chance. The fact that they were human, that they probably hated this war as much as he did, couldn't change what had to be done. "Ready," Riley whispered, playing out detonator wire as he backed away from the cave. "We need to get at least 50 yards clear before I blow this." They retreated carefully, maintaining cover and keeping watch for counterattacks. When they reached the detonation point, Riley crouched behind a coral outcropping and prepared the plunger. "Fire in the hole!" he called out, giving the traditional warning, and then he pushed the plunger down. The explosion was enormous, much larger than Mitchell expected. The TNT had apparently triggered a secondary detonation, probably an ammunition cache inside the cave. Coral fragments rained down like shrapnel, and a pillar of smoke and dust rose into the morning sky. When it cleared, the cave entrance had completely collapsed, tons of coral and rock sealing it forever, along with whoever was inside. "One down," Williams said grimly. "2 more to go." They repeated the process twice more that day, sealing caves and entombing their occupants. By the time they returned to their staging area that evening, Mitchell felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except exhaustion. They'd killed maybe 100 Japanese soldiers without ever seeing their faces, without giving them a chance to fight back or surrender. It was efficient. It was effective. It was the only way to root out defenders who turned the landscape into a fortress. But it felt like murder. That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Mitchell found himself talking with a chaplain who'd been making rounds through the units. Father O'Brien was a Catholic priest from Boston, a man in his 50s who'd volunteered to serve as a military chaplain despite being too old for the draft. He had kind eyes and hands that shook slightly. Whether from age or accumulated trauma, Mitchell couldn't tell. "I keep thinking about the men in those caves," Mitchell said, surprised by his own need to confess. "We didn't give them a choice. We just buried them alive." Father O'Brien was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stars. War is a terrible thing, he said finally. It forces good men to do evil things and then asks them to live with it afterward. I won't insult you by saying it's God's will or that everything happens for a reason. Sometimes there is no good choice, only a choice between different kinds of terrible. Then how do we live with it? How do we go home after this and pretend we're the same people who left? We don't, the chaplain said simply. We can't. We'll be changed by what we've seen and done here. The question is whether we let that change destroy us or whether we use it to become better men, whether we honor the dead by living well or dishonor them by giving up. It wasn't the comforting answer Mitchell had been hoping for, but it was honest. And in this place, where lies were more common than truth, honesty was something to hold on to. The battle for Peleliu ground on through October. The 1st Marine Division, which had landed with over 17,000 men, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. The 1st Marines, Chesty Puller's legendary regiment, had suffered 70% casualties and been withdrawn from the island, its survivors sent to rear areas to recover and regroup. The 7th Marines followed soon after, having lost nearly half their strength. Fresh units rotated in to take their place, but the pattern remained the same. Slow, grinding advances measured in yards, each position taken at terrible cost. The Japanese defenders, commanded by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had transformed the Umur into a death trap that consumed American lives with mechanical efficiency. Mitchell's squad was assigned to support operations in what the maps called Hill 140, a coral ridge that overlooked the entire central valley of Peleliu. Whoever controlled that hill controlled the battlefield, and both sides knew it. The Japanese had fortified it with their usual skill, turning every cave and crevice into a fighting position. The assault began with a tank infantry advance, Sherman tanks leading the way with infantry squads following in their wake. Mitchell's position was on the left flank, supporting the main thrust and watching for counterattacks. The tanks made it perhaps 200 yards before the Japanese opened fire with anti-tank guns, disabling the lead Sherman and forcing the others to retreat. What followed was a day-long firefight that accomplished almost nothing, except adding to the casualty lists. Both sides poured fire at each other across broken ground, neither able to advance without unacceptable losses. By evening, when the shooting finally tapered off, they'd gained maybe 20 yards and lost 6 men killed, 11 wounded. "This is insane," Morrison said as they dug in for the night. "We can't keep doing this. We're beating our heads against a wall." "Command says we're making progress," Williams replied, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it either. "Says we're wearing them down, that eventually they'll run out of supplies and ammunition. How many of us will be dead by then?" Nobody had an answer for that. Mitchell pulled out a letter from home, the first he'd received in over a month. Mail delivery on Peleliu was sporadic at best, and this letter was already 6 weeks old by the postmark. His mother wrote about the victory garden she was tending, about his sister's upcoming graduation, about the war bond drive at church. She asked if he was eating well, if he needed her to send anything, if he was staying safe. The innocence of it made Mitchell want to laugh and cry at the same time. How could he explain this place to her? How could he possibly convey what he'd seen and done, the transformation from the boy who'd left Ohio to the thing he'd become? He couldn't. So he'd write back with reassuring lies about being fine, about good food and good friends, about how it wouldn't be much longer before he came home. The lies were kindness, he told himself. The truth would only hurt her. By late October, the strategic situation on Peleliu had stabilized into a grim stalemate. American forces controlled most of the island, including the airfield that had been the original objective. But the Japanese still held the pocket, that nightmarish maze of caves in the Umur, and showed no signs of surrendering. Command made the decision to contain rather than eliminate, sealing off the remaining defenders and leaving them to slowly die of starvation and thirst. It was a cold calculation, but by that point, nobody had the stomach for more frontal assaults. Too many men had died for this island already. The strategic value, which had been questionable from the start, certainly didn't justify more casualties. Mitchell's unit was pulled back to a rest area, a relative term that meant they weren't actively being shot at, but still lived in holes in the ground and ate cold rations. It was there that he heard the news. The 1st Marine Division was being withdrawn from Peleliu, sent to Pavuvu to rest and rebuild. The Army's 81st Infantry Division would finish mopping up the remaining Japanese resistance. "We're going home," Morrison asked, his face lighting up with hope. "To Pavuvu," Williams corrected. "Not home, just somewhere that's not here." But even that was something. They'd survived Peleliu. Against all odds and reasonable expectations, they'd made it through the nightmare. Others hadn't. Too many others, names and faces that would haunt Mitchell for the rest of his life. But he was alive, and that had to count for something. On November 27, 1944, 74 days after the battle began, the island of Peleliu was officially declared secured. Colonel Nakagawa, the Japanese commander, had committed ritual suicide 2 days earlier after sending a final message to his superiors. "Our sword is broken and our spears are shattered." His remaining defenders, numbering fewer than 300 men, were eventually killed or captured over the following weeks. The cost had been staggering. Nearly 2,000 Americans killed and over 8,000 wounded, a casualty rate that exceeded every other amphibious operation in the Pacific War. The 1st Marine Division had effectively been destroyed as a fighting unit and would need months to recover. Entire companies had been wiped out. Regiments that landed at full strength left as scattered remnants. And for what? The airfield on Peleliu was barely used. The island's strategic value proved to be exactly as negligible as critics had predicted. Men had died by the thousands for a piece of coral that ultimately meant nothing to the war's outcome. Mitchell stood on the beach where they'd landed 2.5 months earlier, waiting to board the transport ship that would take him away from this place. The sand was still littered with debris from the invasion, destroyed landing craft, abandoned equipment, the detritus of industrial warfare. He tried to reconcile the man standing here with the boy who'd hit this beach full of patriotic fervor and naive confidence. That boy was dead. He died somewhere in the jungle, or in the caves, or maybe gradually over 74 days of watching friends die for nothing. The man who remained was harder, colder, hollowed out in ways that might never heal. But he'd survived, and survival, Mitchell had learned, was its own kind of victory. As the ship pulled away from Peleliu, Mitchell took one last look at the island. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful. Green jungle and white beaches under tropical sun. You couldn't see the caves or the graves, couldn't smell the death or feel the terror. It looked like paradise. Mitchell turned away and went below deck. He had letters to write, nightmares to suppress, and the impossible task of figuring out how to keep living after everything he'd experienced. The war wasn't over. There would be more islands, more battles, more friends to lose, but for now, in this moment, he was alive and moving away from hell. It would have to be enough. The island of Pavuvu was supposed to be paradise compared to Peleliu. It had coconut groves, relatively intact infrastructure, and most importantly, no Japanese soldiers trying to kill you. But for the survivors of the 1st Marine Division, it became a different kind of hell, the hell of too much time to think, too many memories that couldn't be suppressed when there was no immediate danger to focus on. Mitchell's nightmares started 3 days after arriving on Pavuvu. Every night, he'd wake up gasping, his hands reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, his mind convinced he was back in the caves with Japanese soldiers emerging from the darkness. The first time it happened, he woke up screaming, and it took Morrison and another Marine to calm him down and convince him he was safe. But he didn't feel safe. He didn't think he'd ever feel safe again. The division held memorial services for the dead, so many dead that the services seemed endless. Names were read, prayers were offered, and men who'd somehow survived stood with heads bowed and tried to make sense of losses that defied understanding. Mitchell attended service after service, hearing names of men he'd known, men he'd fought beside, men who'd died while he somehow lived. Survivor's guilt, the division psychiatrist called it. A normal response to traumatic combat experiences. Mitchell nodded and pretended the clinical term made him feel better, but it didn't. Nothing did. He'd survived when better men died, and there was no logic to it, no fairness, just random chance and the whims of ballistics. The physical wounds healed faster than the psychological ones. Mitchell's leg slowly regained strength through daily physical therapy sessions that were agonizing but necessary. The doctors told him he'd been lucky. Another inch and the shrapnel would have severed his femoral artery, and he'd have bled out before reaching medical care. Lucky. He'd heard that word so many times it had lost all meaning. Letters from home arrived in bundles, forwarded from Peleliu. Mitchell's mother had written almost daily, her concern evident in every line. She wanted to know everything, how he was feeling, what he was doing, when he might come home. His father wrote less frequently but with more depth, talking about the war effort at home, about friends in the community who'd lost sons, about the garden they'd planted in his honor. His sister Sarah wrote about her senior year of high school, about dances and football games and all the normal things that seemed to belong to another universe. She asked him to tell her stories about the war, about adventure and heroism. Mitchell tried to write something that would satisfy her curiosity without traumatizing her with the truth. It was harder than any combat he'd faced. The division began training almost immediately, integrating new replacements and preparing for whatever came next. Mitchell was promoted to sergeant, a battlefield commission based on his actions on Peleliu. It came with more responsibility, more men whose lives would depend on his decisions. The weight of it sat heavy on his shoulders. His new squad included a mix of Peleliu veterans and fresh replacements straight from training. The veterans were easy. They'd seen combat, understood what was coming, needed no explanations. The replacements were harder. They looked at Mitchell with something like awe, asking questions about battle that had no good answers. "What's it like?" asked Private Timothy Walsh, 18 years old and fresh from a farm in Wisconsin. "Combat, I mean. Is it scary?" Mitchell looked at the kid, because that's what he was, a kid, barely old enough to shave, and tried to find words that wouldn't destroy whatever innocence he still possessed. "Yes," he said finally, "it's scary, but you learn to function through the fear. You focus on your training, on the men beside you, and you do what needs to be done. But we're fighting for freedom, right? For democracy? That makes it worthwhile?" "Sure, kid, that's what makes it worthwhile." Mitchell turned away, unable to meet those earnest eyes. He'd believed the same things once, had carried those ideals through boot camp and across the Pacific. Peleliu had burned most of that away, leaving behind something more basic. Survival and brotherhood, the only truths that mattered when bullets were flying, but Walsh didn't need to know that yet. He'd learn soon enough. The routine on Pavuvu was monotonous. Training exercises, equipment maintenance, endless drills designed to keep them sharp. Mitchell found himself volunteering for extra duties just to stay busy, because downtime meant thinking, and thinking led to dark places. Other veterans dealt with it in different ways. Some drank heavily whenever they could get alcohol. Others became withdrawn, going through the motions but clearly somewhere else in their heads. A few simply broke. Unable to handle the psychological strain, they were evacuated to rear-area psychiatric facilities, where overworked doctors tried to put shattered minds back together. Mitchell attended a discussion group organized by Father O'Brien, who'd also survived Peleliu and was now trying to help the survivors process their experiences. About a dozen men showed up to the first meeting, sitting in an awkward circle, while the chaplain gently encouraged them to talk about what they'd been through. At first, nobody wanted to speak. The code of military masculinity demanded that you be strong, that you handle your problems without complaining. But gradually, as the silence stretched, men began to open up. A corporal talked about watching his best friend die. A sergeant described nightmares that left him afraid to sleep. A private admitted he'd started having panic attacks whenever he heard loud noises. When it was Mitchell's turn, he found words pouring out, words he hadn't known he needed to say. He talked about Chen throwing himself on the grenade, about sealing the caves with men inside, about all the small deaths and large ones that had accumulated until he felt buried under them. He talked about the guilt and the anger and the bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying so much death. The other men nodded. They understood in a way that nobody who hadn't been there could. That shared understanding, that recognition that they weren't alone in their struggles, was worth more than all the clinical psychology in the world. "What do we do with it?" Mitchell asked finally. "How do we carry this and still be the men we were before?" "We don't," Father O'Brien said gently. "We can't be who we were before. That's not how trauma works. But we can choose who we become after. We can let it destroy us, or we can use it to become more compassionate, more understanding, more determined to build a world where this doesn't have to happen again." It was a nice thought. Mitchell wanted to believe it, but looking around the circle at faces aged beyond their years, at eyes that had seen too much, he wondered if any of them would ever truly escape Peleliu, or if they'd carry that island with them for the rest of their lives, a ghost that would never fully let go. In December, rumors began circulating about the next operation. The Philippines, most people guessed, or maybe Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Somewhere closer to Japan itself, somewhere that would cost even more lives. The division was nowhere near ready. Too many gaps in the ranks, too much equipment that needed replacing, too many men still dealing with psychological trauma from Peleliu. The war didn't wait for anyone to be ready. It ground forward with mechanical inevitability, consuming men and nations in its insatiable hunger. And Mitchell knew that when the orders came, they'd go. Because that's what soldiers did. They went where they were ordered, fought when they were told to fight, and died when it was their turn. The only honor was in doing it well, in looking after the men beside you, in holding on to whatever humanity you could in circumstances designed to strip it away. Williams, now a lieutenant after his own battlefield commission, called together his NCOs for a planning session. Mitchell attended along with 3 other sergeants, and they discussed how to integrate the new replacements, how to pass on lessons learned from Peleliu, how to prepare men for horrors that couldn't truly be prepared for. "The replacements don't know what they're walking into," said Sergeant Frank Sullivan, a Boston native who'd been with the division since Guadalcanal. "They've got training, sure, but training doesn't capture what combat is really like." "We do what we can," Williams replied. "We drill them until the basics are second nature. We share what we learned on Peleliu, and we hope it's enough. Some of them will die anyway, that's just statistics, but maybe we can improve the odds for the rest." It was a cold equation, but they'd all learned to think in those terms. You couldn't save everyone. You could only try to maximize survival rates and complete the mission. Anything else was sentimentality that got people killed. Mitchell worked with his squad relentlessly over the following weeks, running them through urban combat drills, teaching them how to clear bunkers and caves, showing them techniques for staying alive in the worst conditions. The Peleliu veterans helped, demonstrating tactics they'd learned through trial and error, passing on knowledge purchased with blood. Walsh proved to be a quick learner, soaking up information with the intensity of someone who understood his life might depend on it. He asked good questions, practiced until he got things right, and showed the kind of determination that suggested he might actually survive his first battle. Mitchell found himself hoping the kid would make it, that he wouldn't become another name on another memorial service roster. But hope was dangerous in wartime. It set you up for disappointment and pain. Better to stay detached, to not let yourself care too much about any individual soldier. That's what the experienced NCOs all said. Mitchell tried to follow that advice, but it was impossible. These were human beings, not equipment. They had families and dreams and futures they might never see. Staying detached meant treating them as disposable, and Mitchell couldn't bring himself to do that. Christmas came to Pavuvu with all the forced cheer that military celebrations always carried. The mess hall was decorated with improvised decorations, and they had a special dinner with actual turkey, shipped in frozen from God knew where. Carols were sung, letters from home were shared, and for a few hours the men could pretend they were somewhere else, somewhere safe. Mitchell got a package from home, cookies from his mother, socks his sister had knitted, a letter from his father that spoke of pride and worry in equal measure. He shared the cookies with his squad, watching as they devoured the taste of home with desperate appreciation. Simple pleasures became profound when you'd been living on the edge of death. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Mitchell found himself alone under the tropical stars, thinking about previous Christmases, family gatherings, church services, his mother's cooking, filling the house with warmth and comfort. That life felt like something from a story now, distant and unreal. He wondered if he'd ever get it back, or if the war had changed him too fundamentally to ever fit back into that peaceful world. "You okay, Sergeant?" Walsh had appeared beside him, the young private's face concerned. "Yeah, just thinking." Mitchell managed a smile. "You enjoying your first Christmas away from home?" "Not really, but the cookies were good." Walsh paused. "Can I ask you something? About Peleliu?" Mitchell tensed. "Depends on the question." "Did you ever get scared? Like really scared, where you wanted to run away?" The honest answer was yes. Constantly, throughout every battle, fear had been his constant companion. But Walsh needed something more than raw honesty. He needed hope that courage was possible, even through terror. "Every day," Mitchell said finally, "every single day I was scared. But courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You lean on your training, you focus on the mission, and you look after the men beside you. That's all any of us can do." Walsh nodded slowly, processing this. "Thanks, Sergeant. That helps." After the private left, Mitchell wondered if he'd said the right thing. Was it helpful to tell young men that fear was normal, or was he just preparing them to die? He didn't know anymore. The moral certainties he'd carried into the war had been ground away by experience, leaving behind only questions and doubt. In January 1945, official orders arrived. The 1st Marine Division would participate in the invasion of Okinawa, scheduled for April. It would be the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, involving over 180,000 American troops against an estimated 100,000 Japanese defenders. Intelligence predicted it would be even bloodier than Peleliu. The news was received with grim resignation by the Peleliu veterans. They'd hoped for more time to recover, more time to integrate replacements, more time before facing death again. But hope meant nothing in the face of strategic necessity. Japan had to be defeated, and Okinawa was the next step toward that goal. Training intensified immediately. The division ran through landing exercises, practiced coordination with Navy and Army units, refined tactics based on lessons from previous campaigns. Mitchell pushed his squad harder, knowing that every hour of training now might mean the difference between life and death later. He also wrote letters to Torres, recovering stateside from his injuries, to the families of men who died under his command on Peleliu, to his own family, trying to reassure them while being honest about what he faced. The letters were getting harder to write because the lies wore thin and the truth was too dark to share. In February, they received new equipment, improved flamethrowers, more portable radios, better body armor. The Marine Corps was learning from experience, trying to give its men every possible advantage. But Mitchell knew that equipment could only do so much. What really mattered was training, discipline, and the courage to keep fighting when everything in you screamed to stop. Father O'Brien held another group session, and this time more men attended. The prospect of returning to combat had stirred up anxieties that wouldn't stay buried. They talked about their fears, their nightmares, their doubts about whether they could go through it all again. The chaplain listened without judgment, offering comfort where he could, and honesty where comfort would be a lie. "Some of you won't make it back from Okinawa," he said quietly, and the bluntness of it made everyone go still. "That's just mathematics. We know the casualty projections. But I want you to remember that your life has meaning, that your sacrifice matters, that you're fighting for something bigger than yourselves. Hold on to that when things get dark. Hold on to each other, and hold on to hope that we'll get through this and build a better world from the ashes." It wasn't much, but it was something, and in the face of what they were about to walk into, something was better than nothing. March came too quickly. The division began loading onto transport ships, preparing for the long voyage to Okinawa. Mitchell supervised his squad's loading, making sure everyone had their gear properly stowed, that ammunition was distributed correctly, that the new replacements understood the procedures. As the ship pulled away from Pavuvu, Mitchell stood at the rail and watched the island recede into the distance. He'd hated it, hated the boredom, the oppressive heat, the forced cheerfulness of military rest areas. But now, heading back into combat, he would have given anything to return to that peaceful monotony. Williams appeared beside him, also watching the island disappear. "You ready for this, Sergeant?" Mitchell thought about lying, about giving the confident answer that NCOs were supposed to give, but Williams had been through too much with him for bullshit. "No," he admitted. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I'll do my job and take care of my men. That's all I've got." "That's all any of us have," Williams agreed. "That and each other. We made it through Peleliu together. We'll make it through Okinawa the same way." Mitchell wanted to believe him, but he'd seen too much random death, too much senseless loss, to have faith in survival. All he could do was face whatever came with as much courage as he could muster and hope that it would be enough. The ship steamed west, toward Okinawa, toward the largest battle of the Pacific War. And Mitchell steeled himself for horrors he couldn't yet imagine, drawing strength from the men around him and the memory of those who'd already paid the ultimate price. They were Americans. They would do their duty. And whatever happened next, they would face it together. The voyage to Okinawa took 3 weeks, and every day aboard the transport ship felt like a countdown to oblivion. The Marines filled their time with maintenance, training, and the endless card games that seemed to be the universal soldier's pastime. But beneath the forced normalcy, tension coiled tighter with each passing day. Mitchell used the time to get to know his replacements better. Walsh was proving to be solid, nervous but competent, the kind of soldier who'd follow orders even when terrified. Private Luis Gonzalez from Los Angeles was quieter, keeping to himself but showing good instincts during weapons drills. Corporal Theodore "Teddy" Brennan had transferred from another unit, bringing combat experience from Saipan that made him valuable for mentoring the greenest troops. The Peleliu veterans formed their own informal group, men who'd been through hell together and didn't need to explain their nightmares or thousand-yard stares to each other. Mitchell found himself drawn to their company, even though, or perhaps because, they rarely talked about what they'd experienced. There was comfort in shared silence, in being understood without words. On the ship's deck one evening, Morrison shared intelligence briefings he'd overheard. "Okinawa's different from Peleliu," he said, keeping his voice low. "Bigger, 60 miles long. Over 100,000 Japanese defenders, plus tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians caught in the middle. They're expecting civilian casualties to be massive." "Jesus," Walsh breathed. "Civilians, women and children." "The Japanese military has been indoctrinating them," Morrison continued, "telling them Americans are monsters who'll torture and kill them. Some of them might fight, others might kill themselves rather than be captured. It's going to be a nightmare." Mitchell had heard similar reports. The closer American forces got to the Japanese home islands, the more fanatical the resistance became. Okinawa was considered Japanese soil, part of the homeland itself, and the defenders would fight with a desperation that exceeded anything they'd faced before. "We don't shoot civilians," Mitchell said firmly. "I don't care what command says, what the situation is. We're Americans. We don't kill women and children. Clear?" His squad nodded, but Mitchell saw doubt in some eyes. War had a way of eroding moral certainties, of creating situations where the right choice wasn't clear. He could only hope that when those moments came, his men would hold onto their humanity. Lieutenant Williams briefed the NCOs on the operational plan. The landing would be on the western beaches, less fortified than the eastern side. The 1st Marine Division would be part of the 3 Amphibious Corps, with the mission of securing the northern portion of the island while Army units took the south. Intelligence predicted the heaviest resistance would be in the south, where the Japanese had constructed defensive lines in the island's rugged terrain. "We're expecting kamikaze attacks on the fleet," Williams explained, referring to the suicide pilots who'd begun appearing with increasing frequency. "The Navy's worried. These attacks are incredibly difficult to stop and have been causing significant damage. If the kamikazes manage to cripple our supply lines, we could be in serious trouble." The briefing continued with details about terrain, enemy positions, supply protocols. Mitchell took notes, asked questions, tried to absorb information that might keep his men alive. But underneath the tactical planning, everyone knew the fundamental truth. This was going to be bloody beyond anything they'd yet experienced. On April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, the invasion fleet arrived off the coast of Okinawa. Mitchell stood on deck with his squad, watching the pre-invasion bombardment transform the coastline into an inferno. Battleships and cruisers poured shells into suspected defensive positions, while carrier aircraft dropped bombs and strafed anything that looked like a target. The display of firepower was awesome, almost apocalyptic in scale. "Nothing could survive that," Walsh said, his voice tinged with hope. Mitchell didn't bother correcting him. They'd thought the same thing at Peleliu, and they'd been catastrophically wrong. The Japanese had learned to dig deep, to build positions that could survive anything short of direct hits, to wait out bombardments and emerge ready to fight. American firepower was impressive, but it wasn't enough to break an enemy willing to die rather than surrender. The landing craft lowered away from the transport ships in the pre-dawn darkness, engines sputtering to life and forming up for the run to shore. Mitchell's squad was packed into an LCVP with 30 other Marines, everyone silent with pre-battle tension. The craft circled in the assembly area, while hundreds of others did the same, a vast armada preparing to disgorge thousands of men onto a hostile shore. At H hour, the landing craft surged forward. Mitchell gripped his rifle and tried to control his breathing, tried to quiet the voice in his head that screamed about machine guns and artillery, about dying in the surf before ever reaching the beach. Around him, his squad did the same. Veterans and replacements alike, all united in fear and determination. But when the ramp dropped and they charged onto the beach, there was no resistance. No machine gun fire tore into them, no mortars rained down, no artillery turned the sand into a killing ground. They advanced inland cautiously, expecting ambush at any moment, but found only abandoned positions and empty fortifications. "Where the hell are they?" Morrison asked, expressing everyone's confusion. "Dug in deeper," Williams replied grimly. "They're letting us land, letting us get committed, and then they'll hit us when we're vulnerable. Don't get comfortable. This is just the calm before the storm." The lieutenant was proven right over the following days. As American forces pushed inland, they encountered increasingly heavy resistance. The Japanese had constructed multiple defensive lines across the island's southern portion, taking advantage of rugged terrain and limestone ridges to create fortified positions that were nightmarishly difficult to assault. The 1st Marine Division's mission was to secure the northern portion of the island, which proved to be less heavily defended. They encountered scattered resistance, small units conducting delaying actions before withdrawing to prepared positions. It was frustrating, grinding work that cost steady casualties without producing dramatic results. Mitchell's squad lost their first man on day 4, Private Gonzalez, killed by a sniper while crossing an open field. One moment he was moving forward in a crouch, the next he was down, blood pooling beneath him, while the corpsman frantically tried to find the wound. They never did determine where the shot came from, never saw the sniper who'd taken the life of a 20-year-old kid from Los Angeles. They held a brief service that evening, burial being impossible in active combat conditions. Father O'Brien said prayers over Gonzalez's wrapped body before it was evacuated to the rear for eventual shipment home. Mitchell stood with his squad, watching Walsh struggle not to cry, watching the reality of war hit the replacement hard. "First one's always the worst," Morrison said quietly after the service. "You never forget your first." Mitchell nodded, thinking of Chen and that grenade on Peleliu. He'd carried that memory every day since, would carry it for the rest of his life. Now Gonzalez would join that burden, another ghost to haunt his dreams. By mid-April, the battle for Okinawa had settled into a brutal stalemate. American forces controlled the northern 2/3 of the island, but had run into fortified defensive lines in the south that resisted every assault. The Japanese had prepared positions along ridges and hills with names that would become infamous: Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Shuri Castle. Each position was a fortress, defended by soldiers who would rather die than retreat. The casualty rates were staggering, worse than Peleliu, worse than any other Pacific battle. The 1st Marine Division was committed to the southern sector, thrown into the meat grinder of frontal assaults against prepared positions. Mitchell's squad became part of an attack on Wanna Ridge, a coral escarpment that overlooked a strategic valley. The assault began with artillery preparation that seemed to last forever, the thunder of guns shaking the ground beneath them. Then the whistle blew, and they advanced, moving through smoke and dust toward an enemy they couldn't see, but who could see them all too clearly. Machine gun fire erupted from hidden positions, cutting through the advancing Marines like a scythe. Men fell screaming or silently, crumpling to the ground in ones and twos, and sometimes entire squads. Mitchell hit the dirt, crawling forward while bullets cracked overhead, searching desperately for cover that didn't exist. Walsh was beside him, white-faced with terror, but still moving forward. Brennan had been hit in the leg, but was dragging himself along, leaving a trail of blood. Morrison was yelling something Mitchell couldn't hear over the noise, gesturing toward a shell crater that offered minimal protection. They made it to the crater, Mitchell, Walsh, Morrison, and 3 others. Brennan didn't make it, taking another round that ended him before he could reach safety. 2 more men from the squad were down in the open, one clearly dead, and the other calling weakly for a corpsman who couldn't reach him through the fire. "We can't stay here!" Morrison shouted. "We're pinned down." "We can't advance either," Mitchell shot back. "That ridge is a fortress." The assault stalled across the entire front, American forces taking terrible casualties for minimal gains. By evening, when they finally withdrew to consolidate, Mitchell's squad had lost 4 men killed and 2 wounded, and they'd gained exactly nothing. The Japanese still held WWII Ridge, still commanded the valley, still were killing Americans with mechanical efficiency. That night, huddled in a fighting hole while Japanese artillery fell randomly across their lines, Mitchell experienced something new, a complete loss of faith that they could win this battle. The enemy was too well dug in, too willing to die, too skilled at using terrain to their advantage. American firepower wasn't enough. American courage wasn't enough. They were throwing men's lives away against positions that couldn't be taken, and command kept ordering them to try again. "This is murder," he said to Williams, who'd come to check on the squad. "We're being slaughtered for no gain." "I know," the lieutenant replied, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "But we have orders. We take that ridge or we die trying. Those are the only options command's giving us. There has to be another way, flanking maneuvers, different approach angles, something other than walking into machine guns. You think the generals haven't considered that? This whole island is fortified. Every approach is covered. Every position supports every other position. The Japanese have had months to prepare, and they used the time well." Williams paused. "All we can do is our duty, Mitchell. Keep our men alive as best we can, and hope that eventually superior resources win out." It was cold comfort, but it was all they had. The battle for WWII Ridge continued for 3 more days. 3 days of assaults and withdrawals, of watching men die for yards of ground that would be lost again when the Japanese counterattacked at night. Mitchell's squad was down to half strength, and the replacements they received lasted hours or days before becoming casualties themselves. Walsh survived through a combination of luck and competence, staying close to Mitchell and learning faster than anyone had a right to expect. The kid had lost his innocence somewhere in those 3 days, his face aging years in hours, but he'd proven himself under fire. Morrison took shrapnel from a grenade, but refused evacuation, staying with the squad, despite wounds that should have sent him to the rear. On the 4th day, American forces finally took WWII Ridge through a combination of flamethrowers, demolitions, and sheer bloody-minded persistence. Mitchell was part of the final assault, crawling through mud mixed with blood and rain, throwing grenades into cave mouths and firing at shadows. When they reached the crest and found it abandoned, the Japanese having withdrawn to the next defensive line during the night, Mitchell wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. They'd won. At the cost of hundreds of lives, they'd taken one ridge, and ahead of them stretched dozens more defensive positions, each one requiring the same sacrifice. The battle for Okinawa continued through May and into June, becoming the longest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. The 1st Marine Division fought across the southern portion of the island, taking positions with names like Dakeshi Ridge, Wana Draw, and Sugarloaf Hill. Each was a nightmare of close-quarters combat, of flames and explosives and hand-to-hand fighting in mud and darkness. Mitchell kept fighting because there was no alternative, because his men needed him, because stopping meant dying. He lost track of time and casualties, his world narrowing to the next objective, the next battle, the next hour of survival. The young sergeant from Ohio, who'd believed in heroism and patriotism, felt like someone from another lifetime. What remained was a survivor, a killer, a man who'd seen too much death to ever be whole again. But he kept fighting, they all did. Because they were Americans, because their country had asked this of them, because somewhere beyond the horror was a future that might be worth the price. Or so they told themselves in the brief moments between battles when hope felt possible despite everything. By early June, Okinawa had become an apocalyptic landscape of mud, blood, and unrelenting violence. The seasonal rains had arrived, turning the battlefield into a quagmire that sucked at boots and made every movement exhausting. The dead couldn't be buried properly in the waterlogged ground, and the smell of decomposition hung over everything like a curse. Mitchell's squad had been cycled through so many replacements that he'd stopped learning their names until they'd survived at least a week. It was a defense mechanism, a way to protect himself from the grief of losing someone he'd just started to care about. But it also made him feel like he was losing his humanity, treating men as interchangeable parts rather than human beings. Walsh had somehow survived, though he'd changed dramatically from the farm boy who'd asked naive questions on Pavuvu. He moved with the economy of a veteran now, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, his reactions automatic and efficient. He'd killed more men than he could count, had seen things that would haunt him forever, and had lost the ability to smile. Mitchell recognized the transformation because he'd gone through it himself. The division received orders to assault a position called Half Moon Hill, part of the Shuri defensive line that had been holding up American advances for weeks. Intelligence indicated it was heavily fortified with interconnected tunnel systems, mutually supporting fighting positions and defenders who'd been ordered to hold at all costs. "Same as every other position on this cursed island," Morrison muttered when Williams briefed them. "We attack, take massive casualties, maybe take the position, and then move on to do it all again." "You have a better idea?" Williams asked, his patience worn thin by weeks of grinding combat. "Yeah, firebomb the whole island and declare victory," Morrison shot back, but without real heat. They were all too exhausted for genuine anger. The assault began at dawn with the usual artillery preparation. Mitchell's squad advanced as part of a larger push. Moving through terrain they'd already fought over multiple times. The Japanese had reoccupied positions American forces had cleared days earlier, turning every yard into contested ground that had to be taken again and again. They reached the base of Half Moon Hill and encountered the expected resistance. Machine gun fire from hidden positions, mortars falling with devastating accuracy, snipers picking off anyone who exposed themselves for more than seconds. Mitchell ordered his squad to take cover in a shell crater while he tried to identify firing positions. "There!" Walsh pointed toward a cave entrance partially hidden by vegetation. Muzzle flashes sparked from its darkness, and Mitchell could see Japanese soldiers moving inside. "We need a flamethrower team," Mitchell called out. Within minutes, 2 Marines arrived with the bulky weapon. Mitchell directed them toward the cave entrance, and they unleashed a torrent of liquid fire that transformed the position into an inferno. The screams from inside were terrible, men burning alive, their agony echoing across the battlefield. Mitchell forced himself not to think about it, not to see them as human beings, with families and lives. They were enemy soldiers who would kill his men if given the chance. That had to be enough. But it wasn't. Not really. Each time he ordered fire into a cave, each time he heard those screams, something inside him died a little more. He was becoming efficient at killing, skilled at the mechanics of death, and that transformation terrified him more than any Japanese soldier could. The assault on Half Moon Hill lasted 3 days of continuous combat. Mitchell's squad was reduced to 5 effectives, himself, Walsh, Morrison, and 2 replacements who'd arrived just days before. They'd taken and lost the same ground multiple times, each cycle costing more lives. When the position finally fell, Mitchell felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning. Lieutenant Williams found him that evening, sitting in a shell hole and staring at nothing. The officer looked as hollowed out as Mitchell felt, his eyes sunken and his hands trembling slightly. "We're being pulled off the line," Williams said. 3 days rest, then back into it. They're bringing up the 6th Marine Division to relieve us." 3 days, Mitchell repeated flatly. "Then more of this." "Yes." Williams sat down beside him. "I know it's hard, Mitchell. I know it feels endless. But we're making progress. The Japanese lines are collapsing. Another few weeks, and this island will be ours." "And how many of us will be left to see it?" Williams had no answer for that. The rest period passed in a blur of equipment maintenance, minimal sleep, and futile attempts to process what they'd experienced. Mitchell wrote letters home that were mostly lies, reassuring his family that he was fine, that the battle was going well, that he'd be home soon. The truth, that he was barely holding together, that he'd lost count of how many men he'd killed, that he woke up screaming most nights, would only hurt them. Father O'Brien held services that fewer and fewer men attended. Faith was a casualty of this battle, worn away by relentless horror until even prayer felt pointless. Mitchell went anyway, more from habit than belief, and listened to the chaplains struggle to find meaning in senseless slaughter. "God hasn't abandoned us," O'Brien said, his voice carrying less conviction than before. "Even in this darkness, we're not alone. We have each other, and we have hope that this will end, that we'll build something better from these ashes." Mitchell wanted to believe him, but hope felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. They returned to the line in mid-June, assigned to operations around Shuri Castle, the centerpiece of the Japanese defensive system. By this point, the strategic situation had shifted. The Japanese lines were collapsing under sustained American pressure, defenders were running low on supplies and ammunition, and victory was becoming inevitable. But inevitable didn't mean easy. The Japanese fought with increasing desperation, launching suicide attacks and conducting guerrilla operations behind American lines. Civilians caught in the fighting died by the thousands, sometimes from American fire, but more often from Japanese soldiers who'd convinced them that capture meant torture and death. Mitchell's squad encountered Okinawan civilians for the first time during a patrol through a village that had been abandoned by its defenders. They found families hiding in caves and destroyed buildings, women, children, elderly men, all terrified beyond reason. Some tried to run, others cowered and waited for death, and a few attempted to fight with farming implements and rocks. "Don't shoot," Mitchell ordered his men. "They're civilians, not combatants." But convincing the Okinawans they were safe proved nearly impossible. Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as monsters, and weeks of bombardment and combat had given them no reason to doubt it. It took hours of patient effort, of demonstrating peaceful intentions, before the civilians would accept food and medical care. Walsh worked with an elderly woman who'd been injured in the shelling, bandaging her wounds with the squad's limited medical supplies. The woman wept and spoke in Okinawan dialect that none of them understood, but her gratitude was evident. It was the first purely good thing Mitchell had done in months, helping someone without killing someone else, and it reminded him that humanity still existed beneath the layers of violence. By late June, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa was collapsing. American forces had broken through the Shuri line and were pushing the remnants of the Japanese army into the southern tip of the island. The end was in sight, though it would take weeks more of fighting to secure complete victory. Mitchell's squad participated in clearing operations, rooting out holdouts and stragglers who refused to surrender. It was dangerous, exhausting work that required constant vigilance. Japanese soldiers would hide among civilians, use booby traps, and launch suicide attacks when cornered. The division was losing men daily, despite the improving strategic situation. On June 21st, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commander of all American ground forces on Okinawa, was killed by Japanese artillery fire while observing frontline operations. His death so close to victory felt like a cruel joke, one more senseless loss in a campaign that had already cost too much. The battle officially ended on June 22, 1945, with the collapse of the last organized Japanese resistance. But mopping-up operations would continue for weeks, as thousands of Japanese soldiers refused to surrender and had to be hunted down individually. The cost had been staggering, over 12,000 American dead and 38,000 wounded, making it the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Japanese casualties exceeded 100,000, and between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians had died, perhaps a third of the island's population. Dean Mitchell stood on a ridge overlooking the devastated landscape and tried to feel something about victory. They'd won. After 3 months of the most brutal combat imaginable, after losses that exceeded every previous Pacific battle, they'd taken Okinawa. It should have meant something. It should have felt like an achievement, but all he felt was empty. The weeks after Okinawa's official securing were strange. Combat operations continued as holdouts were eliminated, but the intensity had diminished. Mitchell's squad spent their days patrolling, searching caves, and trying to convince remaining civilians that surrender meant safety rather than death. It was exhausting work, but nothing compared to the intensity of the main battle. Walsh had survived the entire campaign, though barely. The young private had been wounded twice, once by shrapnel that left scars across his back, and once by a bullet that grazed his shoulder. But he'd refused evacuation both times, staying with the squad through sheer stubbornness. Mitchell had come to rely on him in ways he'd never expected, trusting the farm boy from Wisconsin with his life. Morrison's luck had finally run out in the final week of heavy fighting. He'd taken a machine gun burst to the chest during a patrol and died before the corpsman could reach him. Mitchell had held him during his last moments, watching the light fade from his friend's eyes, while Morrison tried to say something that never quite came out. It was the kind of death that happened constantly during the battle, nothing special or heroic, just another casualty in a war that consumed men like fuel. The division held services for the dead, but there were too many for individual ceremonies. Hundreds of names were read, prayers were offered, and surviving Marines stood in formation while trying not to think about which of their friends were on those lists. Mitchell attended every service, feeling like he owed it to the men he'd lost, though he wasn't sure what difference his presence made. Father O'Brien found him after one service, the chaplain looking older than his years and infinitely tired. "How are you holding up, Sergeant?" "I'm alive," Mitchell replied. "That's more than a lot of men can say." "Survival is its own burden," O'Brien observed. "The question is what you do with it. Do you let guilt consume you, or do you find a way to honor those who fell?" "I don't know how to do that. How do you honor thousands of deaths? How do you make that mean something?" The chaplain was quiet for a long moment. "You live well, you build a good life. You remember them, tell their stories, and work to create a world where this doesn't have to happen again. It's not much, but it's all we have." It sounded reasonable when O'Brien said it, but Mitchell wondered if he'd ever be capable of living well again. The war had changed him too fundamentally. He'd killed too many people, watched too many friends die, spent too long existing in a state of constant terror. How did you come back from that? How did you return to civilian life and pretend you were normal? In early July, the division received orders to prepare for the invasion of Japan itself. Intelligence briefings predicted casualties in the millions, both American and Japanese, as the war reached its climax on the home islands. Operation Downfall, as it was codenamed, would be the largest amphibious operation in history, dwarfing even D-Day in Europe. The news was received with grim resignation by the Peleliu and Okinawa veterans. They'd survived two of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, and now they were being asked to participate in something even worse. Mitchell looked at his depleted squad, Walsh and 3 replacements who'd barely had time to learn each other's names, and wondered how many would survive an invasion of Japan. Probably none of them. Training began immediately, though it felt perfunctory. They all knew what an opposed landing looked like, knew the tactics for clearing fortified positions, knew how to kill and how to die. More training wouldn't change the fundamental calculus. They were going to invade a fanatical enemy's homeland, and the cost would be catastrophic. Walsh found Mitchell one evening, the young Marine's face troubled. "Sarge, you think we'll actually have to do it? Invade Japan?" "Orders say we will," Mitchell replied. "Unless something changes, yeah, we're going in. We won't make it, will we? I mean, if Peleliu and Okinawa were that bad, and Japan will be worse." Walsh trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Mitchell wanted to lie, to offer false reassurance, but Walsh deserved honesty. "Probably not. The casualty projections are bad, really bad. But we'll do our duty, and maybe we'll get lucky. That's all any of us can do." Walsh nodded slowly, accepting this grim truth with the fatalism that combat veterans developed. "Thanks for being straight with me, Sarge. I'd rather know what we're walking into." But they never had to invade Japan. On August 6, 1945, word spread through the division about a new weapon, a single bomb dropped on a Japanese city called Hiroshima that had destroyed it completely. The details were vague and almost unbelievable. One bomb, an entire city gone. Casualties in the tens of thousands, possibly more. 3 days later, a second bomb hit Nagasaki with similar devastating results. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The war was over. The reaction among the Marines was complex, relief and joy mixed with guilt and sorrow. They'd survived. Against all odds, despite Peleliu and Okinawa and everything they'd endured, they'd lived to see the war's end. But so many others hadn't. The celebrations felt hollow when conducted among empty spaces where friends should have been standing. Mitchell sat alone that evening, watching the sun set over Okinawa's scarred landscape, and tried to process what peace meant. No more battles, no more watching men die, no more having to kill or risk being killed. It should have felt like liberation, but mostly it just felt strange, like a fundamental part of his reality had suddenly disappeared, leaving a void he didn't know how to fill. Walsh found him there, and they sat in companionable silence for a while. Finally, the younger Marine spoke. "What do we do now, Sarge?" "We go home," Mitchell said. "We try to build lives. We try to be the men we were before all this, or figure out who we are now if that's impossible." "You think we can, after everything?" "I don't know," Mitchell admitted. "But we have to try. That's what all those men died for, so we could have a chance at peace, at normal lives. We owe it to them to at least try." The division remained on Okinawa through the fall of 1945, handling occupation duties and waiting for transport home. The days were filled with routine tasks that felt absurdly mundane after years of combat: paperwork, guard duty, equipment inventory. Mitchell went through the motions, while his mind struggled to adjust to a reality without immediate threats. He wrote long letters home, finally able to be more honest about what he'd experienced without worrying about censors or causing alarm. He wrote about Peleliu and Okinawa, about the friends he'd lost, about the burden of survival and the challenge of returning to civilian life. His mother wrote back with love and concern, promising that the whole family would be waiting when he finally came home. In October, Mitchell received his discharge orders. He was going home, back to Ohio, back to a life that felt like something from a dream. The division held a final formation, and senior officers gave speeches about duty and honor and the sacrifices that had won the war. Mitchell listened politely, but the words felt empty. The real story of what they'd done, the terror and death and moral compromises, would never make it into official histories. He said goodbye to Walsh, who was being discharged at a different time. They embraced briefly, two men who'd shared hell and survived, and promised to stay in touch, though both knew they probably wouldn't. Some experiences were too intense to maintain connection afterward. The reminder of what you'd been through became its own burden. The journey home took weeks, first by ship to Hawaii, then to San Francisco. Mitchell spent much of the voyage on deck, staring at the ocean and trying to prepare himself for civilian life. What would he do? Who would he be? The boy who'd enlisted in 1941 was gone, and the man who'd survived Peleliu and Okinawa didn't know how to exist in a peaceful world. When the ship finally docked in San Francisco, crowds were there to greet the returning veterans, families, friends, strangers waving flags and cheering. Mitchell scanned the faces and found his parents, his sister Sarah, now a young woman he barely recognized. They rushed forward, embracing him with tears and joy, and he tried to feel the happiness that was clearly expected. But all he felt was disconnected, like he was watching the reunion from outside his own body. This didn't feel real. The crowds, the celebration, the safety, none of it matched the reality he'd been living for the past 4 years. He was home, but he didn't feel like he belonged here anymore. The train ride from San Francisco to Ohio gave Mitchell time to decompress, to slowly adjust to being surrounded by civilians who'd never heard artillery fire or smelled decomposing bodies. His parents sat beside him, asking gentle questions about his service while carefully avoiding anything too specific. They could see the changes in him, the way he startled at loud noises, the distant look in his eyes, the reluctance to talk about his experiences. Sarah, now 17 and full of questions, was more direct. Did you see a lot of combat? Did you have to, kill people? Their mother shushed her, but Mitchell shook his head. It's okay. He turned to his sister. Yes, I saw combat. More than I can really explain. And yes, I had to do things I'm not proud of. Things that were necessary, but that I'll carry with me forever. That's what war is. Not the heroic version from movies, but something uglier and sadder. Sarah looked troubled by this answer, but she nodded. I'm just glad you're home safe. So am I, Mitchell said, and meant it, despite the complicated emotions that came with survival. Their hometown looked exactly the same houses, same streets, same community center where he'd attended dances that felt like they'd happened in another lifetime. Everyone treated him like a hero, thanking him for his service and asking questions he didn't know how to answer. How was the war? What was it like over there? Did you meet anyone famous? He smiled and gave vague, positive responses because nobody really wanted to hear the truth. They wanted reassurance that the sacrifices had been worth it, that their sons and brothers and husbands had died for something meaningful. Mitchell couldn't bring himself to take that comfort away from them, even though his own certainty about meaning had been eroded by experience. The nightmares were worst at home. In combat, surrounded by other soldiers who understood, his trauma had found context. But here, in his childhood bedroom with his mother's cooking smells drifting up the stairs and his father reading the newspaper downstairs, the nightmares felt invasive and wrong. He'd wake up gasping, reaching for weapons that weren't there, his mind convinced he was back in the caves of Peleliu or the ridges of Okinawa. His parents heard him, of course. They'd stand outside his door, hesitant to intrude, while he struggled to calm his racing heart and remember where he was. During the day, they'd pretend nothing had happened, maintaining a fiction of normalcy that everyone knew was false. Mitchell enrolled at Ohio State University using the GI Bill, figuring education was as good a path as any toward building a new life. The campus was full of veterans, men like him who were trying to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. They recognized each other instantly, bonded by shared experiences they couldn't fully articulate to civilians. He met other Okinawa veterans, and they formed an informal support group, meeting weekly to talk about their struggles with reintegration. They discussed nightmares and survivor guilt, the difficulty of relating to people who hadn't been through combat, the challenge of finding purpose in civilian life. These conversations helped more than any official counseling because they came from genuine understanding rather than clinical observation. One of these veterans was a former army soldier named Robert Chen. No relation to the Chen who died on Peleliu, but the name hit Mitchell like a punch to the gut when they first met. Robert had fought in Europe, had seen different horrors in different places, but the psychological impact was similar. They became friends, finding comfort in shared experience even though their wars had been on opposite sides of the world. Mitchell studied history, drawn to understanding the larger context of what he'd experienced. He read about the strategic decisions that had led to Peleliu, how military planners had deemed it necessary, how critics had questioned its value, how it had ultimately contributed little to the war's outcome. Thousands had died for that island, and for what? So American forces could skip it on their way to more important objectives. The bitterness of that realization was profound. But as he studied deeper, read more widely, Mitchell began to develop a more nuanced understanding. War was messy. Decisions made with incomplete information, commanders doing their best with imperfect knowledge, strategies that seemed sound but proved costly. Nobody had wanted Peleliu to be a bloodbath. It just happened that way, through a combination of intelligence failures and Japanese tactical innovations. Understanding didn't erase the pain, but it helped Mitchell stop blaming specific people and recognize the systematic factors that led to tragedy. It was cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. He started dating a nursing student named Eleanor, who'd spent the war working in a veterans hospital and had her own understanding of trauma. She didn't press him to talk about his experiences, didn't expect him to be whole and healed, just accepted him as he was, damaged but trying. They spent hours together in quiet companionship, building a relationship that didn't require Mitchell to pretend he wasn't carrying profound scars. When he finally did tell her about Peleliu and Okinawa, bits and pieces over many months, she listened without judgment. She didn't try to fix him or minimize what he'd been through. She just held his hand and acknowledged that what he'd experienced was real and terrible, and that healing would take time. That acceptance meant more than Mitchell could express. He reconnected with Walsh through a veterans organization, and they exchanged letters regularly. The former farm boy had returned to Wisconsin and was working his family's land, finding peace in the rhythms of agricultural life. He wrote about nightmares and struggles, but also about small joys, a good harvest, a beautiful sunset, his family's support. His letters reminded Mitchell that survival was possible, that men who'd been through hell could still build meaningful lives. In 1948, Mitchell and Eleanor married in a small ceremony attended by family and a few veteran friends. Father O'Brien, who'd survived the war and returned to his parish in Boston, came to officiate. The chaplain looked older, but retained the kindness that had helped so many men through dark times. "You've come a long way from Peleliu," O'Brien said at the reception. "I'm proud of you, James. You've chosen life over despair, hope over bitterness. That takes more courage than combat ever did." Mitchell wasn't sure about that, but he appreciated the sentiment. Building a life was hard in different ways than fighting had been. less dramatic, but requiring sustained effort over years rather than moments of extreme intensity. He graduated with a degree in history and became a teacher, finding purpose in educating the next generation. He never spoke about his combat service in class unless specifically asked. But his understanding of war, its complexity, its cost, its human dimension, informed everything he taught. His students sensed something in him, a depth of experience that made historical events feel personal rather than abstract. Eleanor gave birth to their first child in 1950, a son they named Robert Chen Mitchell, honoring the friend who'd sacrificed himself on Peleliu. Holding his newborn son, Mitchell felt something shift inside him. This was what he'd fought for, what all those men had died for, not abstractions about freedom or democracy, but this. The chance to build families, raise children, create futures in a world not consumed by war. The Korean War broke out that same year, and Mitchell watched with complicated emotions as a new generation of young men went off to fight. He wanted to warn them, to tell them what they were walking into, but he also understood that some lessons could only be learned through experience. Instead, he did what he could, writing letters to deployed service members, speaking at veterans events, advocating for better mental health support for returning soldiers. In 1952, he attended a reunion of Peleliu survivors. Men he'd fought beside came from across the country, and they spent a weekend sharing memories and catching up on lives. Some were doing well, had found peace and purpose. Others were clearly struggling, drinking too much and jumping at loud noises, unable to fully escape the island that haunted them. They held a memorial service for those who hadn't made it home, reading names that brought back floods of memory. Chen, Baker, Russo, Morrison, Hernandez, Kohler, hundreds of others whose names were carved into Mitchell's memory. The survivors wept openly, no longer needing to maintain military stoicism, allowing themselves to grieve men they'd lost years earlier. Williams was there, now a successful businessman, but still recognizable as the lieutenant who'd led them through hell. They embraced, two men who'd shared the worst of times and somehow made it through. Williams looked healthy, had built a good life, but Mitchell saw the same shadows in his eyes that he knew were in his own. "We made it," Williams said simply. "Against all odds, we're here." "And we owe it to them," Mitchell replied, gesturing at the memorial list. "To live well. To make it mean something. Have you made it mean something?" Mitchell thought about his wife, his son, his students, the small ways he tried to make the world better. "I'm trying," he said. "Every day I'm trying. That's all any of us can do." Over the following decades, Mitchell built a life that honored the fallen through his commitment to peace, education, and family. He had 3 more children, watched them grow up in a world that, while imperfect, wasn't consumed by global war. He taught thousands of students, helping them understand history's complexity and the human cost of conflict. He volunteered with veterans organizations, helping younger generations of combat veterans navigate their own struggles with reintegration. The nightmares never completely stopped, but they became less frequent. The grief never disappeared, but it evolved into something he could carry without being crushed by it. The guilt of survival remained, but he learned to balance it with gratitude for the life he'd been given and determination to make that life worthwhile. In 1994, 50 years after the Battle of Peleliu, Mitchell returned to the island for the first time since leaving it in 1944. Now, 72 years old, he walked the beaches where he'd landed, climbed the ridges where he'd fought, stood in the caves where so many had died. The island had been reclaimed by nature, jungle growth covering the scars of battle, but the bones of war remained, rusted equipment, destroyed bunkers, memorial markers. He found the location where Chen had thrown himself on that grenade, saving Mitchell and others at the cost of his own life. Standing there, Mitchell finally allowed himself to fully feel the weight of 50 years of survival, 50 years of carrying that sacrifice. He wept, for Chen, for all the others, for the young men they'd been before the war changed them forever. But he also felt gratitude. He'd been given half a century that Chen never got. Time to build a family, pursue a career, experience love and loss, and all the messy complexity of a full life. That was a gift, one he'd tried to honor through how he lived. Back home, Mitchell continued teaching until retirement, then devoted his time to writing a memoir about his experiences. Not for publication, he had no illusions that anyone would want to read one more veteran's story, but for his children and grandchildren, so they'd understand what their grandfather had been through and why he sometimes seemed distant or sad for no apparent reason. The memoir was honest in ways he'd never been able to be in person. He wrote about the terror and the killing, about moral compromises and psychological damage, about friendships forged in crisis and losses that never healed. He wrote about Chen's sacrifice and Baker's death and Morrison's final moments. He wrote about the civilians caught in the crossfire and the enemy soldiers he'd killed without knowing their names. But he also wrote about courage. Not the Hollywood version, but the real kind. The courage of ordinary men doing extraordinary things because duty and brotherhood demanded it. The courage of surviving trauma and building lives despite profound damage. The courage of choosing hope over despair, day after day, year after year. He finished the memoir in 2000 and presented copies to his children on Christmas. They read it with tears and newfound understanding, seeing their father not just as a parent, but as a young man who'd been tested beyond imagination and somehow endured. James Mitchell died in 2012 at the age of 90, surrounded by family and at peace with the life he'd lived. His obituary mentioned his military service briefly, WWII veteran who fought in the Pacific Theater, but didn't capture the full scope of what he'd experienced and overcome. His children inherited his medals, his letters, his memoir. They inherited the name of Robert Chen Mitchell, the grandson who'd been named for a hero. They inherited his example of a man who'd been through hell, but chose life, who'd carried profound grief, but found joy, who'd seen humanity's worst, but never stopped believing in its potential for good. That was James Mitchell's legacy. Not the battles he'd fought or the enemies he'd killed, but the life he'd built from the ruins of war. A life that honored the fallen, by being lived fully and well, by contributing to a better world, by showing that survival could be more than just continuing to breathe. It could be a choice to thrive despite everything. He was buried in his hometown cemetery, not far from where he'd grown up. His headstone was simple. James Mitchell, 1922-2012. Sergeant, USMC, Peleliu, Okinawa. Beloved husband, father, grandfather. He carried them all home, and in a way he had. Every man he'd lost, every friend who'd fallen, he'd carried their memories through a long life, keeping them alive through remembrance. That was the final duty of those who survived war, to remember the cost, to honor the sacrifice, and to build something better from what remained. The war had taken much from James Mitchell, his innocence, his youth, his peace of mind, but it hadn't taken everything. He'd found love, raised a family, made a difference in his community, and lived to see his grandchildren grow. That was victory of a different kind, quieter than military triumph, but no less real. And perhaps that was the truest heroism of all, not the dramatic sacrifices remembered in history books, but the daily choice to keep living, keep hoping, keep building, despite everything. To survive the unsurvivable and still find reasons to be grateful. To carry the weight of profound loss without being crushed by it. That was what the anonymous heroes of the Pacific had done, not just the ones who'd died in glory, but the ones who'd lived on, carrying their burdens in silence, building the post-war world through sheer determination and quiet courage. Their story deserved to be remembered, not sanitized or glorified, but told honestly, with all its pain and complexity, its losses and its small triumphs. Because that was how you honored sacrifice, not by pretending it didn't hurt, but by acknowledging the cost and living in ways that made that cost worthwhile. James Mitchell had done that. So had thousands of others whose names would never be known, whose stories would never be told. They were the true heroes, not because of what they'd done in battle, but because of how they'd lived afterward. And their legacy lived on in the families they'd raised, the communities they'd built, the students they'd taught, and the better world they'd helped create from the ashes of war. That was enough. It had to be.